Hey guys! The Empire knelt before her, yet nobody could bear the stench. When people stood beside her in that magnificent palace, they didn't catch the fragrance of flowers, but rather the reek of aged perspiration, stale perfume, and unwashed nightclothes. The filthiest secrets weren't stored in the royal records, but buried deep within every fold of fabric, every mattress, every lingering mark. Tonight, let's settle in and dive into the revolting hygiene practices of Queen Victoria. So, before you get settled, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's watching us from around the globe. Now, we lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that calming background noise, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one examines the daily routines of Queen Victoria, the most remarkable detail, at first, is her peculiar dread of water. Bathing was viewed by her as an action that could drain the body, upset the harmony of her well-being, and even challenge her sense of control. This wasn't completely a creation of her own imagination, since, in the Victorian period, many individuals suspected that sudden exposure to cold water could cause chills, fevers, or something worse. Still, her opposition was much more intense than that of her people. She avoided immersion at every opportunity. Rather than using a bath as we would recognize it today, she relied on fabric dipped in alcohol. Wine or liquor would be splashed over soft towels, and these towels were wiped across her skin to create an illusion of cleanliness. The alcohol may have produced a cooling sensation, and it may have destroyed a few surface bacteria, but it couldn't substitute the purpose of water and soap. The tubs that stood in her chambers were not centres of hygiene, but objects seldom filled with fresh water when they were utilised. It wasn't by maintaining any standard of cleanliness that we would recognise. Water was added in, sometimes employed more than once, and only switched out when the shade changed or a smell became undeniable. This method was closer to preserving appearances than to preserving health. To consider it now is disturbing. It's almost comical that a woman who commanded an empire thought that sitting in a basin of stagnant water was a mark of discipline rather than carelessness. Yet within the palace boundaries, her decisions became the norm, and no servant was in a position to object. The staff were told to keep cloths and alcohol constantly available. These supplies were to be arranged daily so that the Queen could wipe herself whenever she desired. The scent of liquor stuck to her flesh, creating the impression that she had just exited a tavern rather than a bedroom. A smell remained on her dresses and in the material of the furniture. Servants observed, naturally, but none dared speak up. To do so would risk charges of disrespect. Silence was the expectation, obedience the obligation. This silence reached beyond the staff. Courtiers and attending officials understood nothing of these private customs. They witnessed the Queen, in her public capacity, dream, clothed in silks and jewellery, her image meticulously maintained, behind shut doors. Nevertheless, the reality was different. The heavy drapes were kept drawn to prevent drafts. The windows rarely opened, and the rooms were thick with air that hadn't been renewed. Every material soaked up what her body expelled. The combination of alcohol, perspiration, and unwashed flesh created a smell that would have forced itself onto anyone who walked in. If this were to occur today, it would be like a head of state refusing to bathe, and instead covering themselves with fragranced wipes, demanding that the body's natural smell should simply be tolerated. The deception might survive in photographs or rituals, but not for those who spent time around the person. The notion of bathing as hazardous was connected to Victorian medical confusion. Doctors themselves were split on what triggered disease, and common people were left to superstition. Victoria's determination on avoiding water was an extreme but not uncommon version of this. Still, for someone of her influence, it established a troubling precedent. Her personal conviction became procedure not only for herself, but for those who had to attend to her. Servants were expected to follow her directions precisely, regardless of their own judgment. They transported basins of reused water, managed cloths moist with wine, and tolerated the stale odour of a body only partially clean. For them, it was work without question. The palace wasn't designed to handle such carelessness gracefully. Heavy velvet drapes, thick wool rugs, and elaborate upholstery captured every smell. Without fresh air or complete washing, these surfaces became permanent storage for the Queen's routines. Dust blended with alcohol vapours, sweat embedded into fibres, and the environment grew heavier each week. It was a space intended to display wealth, yet it quietly gathered the evidence of poor hygiene. I find it disturbing to picture entering a grand room decorated with gold and velvet, only to be greeted with the bitter smell of unwashed flesh concealed by spirits. This isn't an image of royalty, but of refusal. There were some efforts by physicians to convince her otherwise, but they were short and unsuccessful. The knowledge of the time was too questionable to provide authority powerful enough to challenge the Queen's beliefs. A recommendation to bathe more frequently could be dismissed as medical fashion. Victoria relied on her own sense of discipline more than the advice of her doctors. She thought that resisting indulgence made her tougher. And to her, bathing was indulgence. Her children and close servants were unavoidably influenced by this setting. To exist near her was to exist with her regulations. That meant tolerating the smells, obeying the rituals, and never voicing openly their reservations. What might have been viewed as peculiar in another household became undeniable in hers. The clash between public image and private reality was severe. In public, she was the picture of discipline and power. In private, she maintained practices that belonged more to ancient fears than to contemporary science. The opposition to water influenced her life for decades. It wasn't a temporary habit, but a permanent belief. This makes it one of the characteristic features of her private existence. When one considers Queen Victoria now, one pictures stern portraits, royal rituals, and political influence. But concealed beneath those images was a woman who regarded water an adversary and substituted it with wine-soaked towels. Her dread of water was more than just a personal oddity. It influenced the cleanliness of her chambers, the wellness of those surrounding her, and the ease of everyone who walked into her space. It left behind smells and traces that stuck to the palace itself. In a century that took pride in progress, innovation, and empire, this habit emerged as a reminder that superstition and carelessness could exist even in the centre of power. Hook, 3 sentences as demanded. Victoria's refusal to bathe left her depending on alcohol-soaked cloths and stagnant water, saturating her rooms with smells that never disappeared. Yet what transported those smells most directly weren't the drapes or the rugs, but the clothes she wore against her own flesh. Each day, those clothes became objects of distress, managed with care and privacy by the servants who didn't dare disobey her. The clothes worn closest to Queen Victoria's body were among the most intimate objects in the palace, yet they became a source of unease and silent dread. Her underclothes were thick, substantial layers designed to soak up sweat, oils, and menstrual blood, and they weren't changed. Frequently, these clothes were worn for multiple days consecutively, and only when the marks and discoloration became impossible to ignore were they finally taken off. Servants couldn't propose a change, nor could they respond without her explicit instruction. The choice belonged to her alone, and her command determined how long each piece would stay in use. This left those who managed the clothing in a challenging position, compelled to obey orders that violated the fundamental standards of cleanliness. The fabric of the undergarments was durable, but rough cotton and linen layers grew rigid with repeated use, sticking to the body as they gathered the fluids of daily existence. Sweat penetrated through during hot days and cold nights equally, leaving dark spots that stiffened as they dried. During menstruation, the marks deepened and the clothes became weighted with a mixture of fluids. Despite this, the Queen kept wearing them, persuaded that regular changes weakened the body and interrupted its natural patterns. It's almost ridiculous to consider the wealthiest woman in the world treating her underwear like an heirloom to be maintained, rather than a simple necessity to be cleaned. When a garment was eventually taken off, the servants had explicit instructions. They were to fold it cautiously, sometimes air it beside a window, and then place it away until instructed otherwise. Washing wasn't automatic, and in some instances the item would simply be dried and reused without appropriate cleaning. Servants were cautioned not to hold the fabric too near to their faces as the odour could overpower them. They transported the clothes at arm's distance, trying not to inhale too deeply. The act of tending to these garments wasn't a task anyone desired, but it was a task none could decline. The smell was inescapable. Even when folded and positioned in storage, the odour persisted in the air. Closets absorbed the scent of stale perspiration and old marks, distributing it gradually into the corners of the chamber. The longer the clothes were left unwashed, the more stubborn the smell grew. It attached to the fabric of chairs, to drapes, and even to the hands of those who handled it. In a palace filled with expensive materials, these persistent odours generated a silent tension. They reminded everyone who laboured there that underneath the surface of wealth and influence was a body left dirty. For the Queen, the hesitation to wash or replace undergarments was tied to a belief in discipline. She viewed endurance as a virtue and considered discomfort as evidence of strength. If a garment felt rigid or heavy, it was a signal to her that she was resisting weakness, not a reason to change. The servants who experienced the consequences had no such consolation. To them, it was simply filth and odour, transported day after day until their work required they handle it again. If this occurred today, it would be like a world leader insisting that the same underwear could be worn for weeks, with assistants assigned to fold and air it rather than wash it. The comparison makes obvious how bizarre and degrading this practice would be in any era. Medical guidance was occasionally offered, but the Queen trusted her own routines more than the statements of physicians. In her mind, excessive washing could trigger irritation or weakness, and cleanliness didn't mean continuous renewal. What seemed to outsiders as carelessness was to her discipline and control. This conviction was reinforced by her authority, which suppressed any resistance. Servants understood that questioning her commands would mean termination, and termination from royal service was a disaster few could afford. So they complied, executing their responsibilities in silence, even when the work was repulsive. There were naturally health consequences. Extended contact with soiled fabric triggered rashes, irritation, and sometimes infections. These were rationalized away as natural ailments or the inevitable effects of age. Nobody could indicate that the routines themselves might be the source. Silence became the protection that defended her practices, and those who lived with the results had no option but to endure. I find it disturbing to picture being one of those servants forced to fold clothes rigid with marks and place them tidily away as if they were fine linens. The thought emphasizes how power can transform ordinary disgust into an accepted custom. The clothes symbolized more than carelessness. They reflected the contradictions of her rule. She commanded a nation that took pride in progress, yet her personal existence resisted the simplest improvements in hygiene. She was the symbol of an empire, but her daily practices would have been deemed unacceptable even among the working poor. In this way, the underclothes became an invisible emblem of contradiction. They were concealed from public sight, but within the palace, they shaped the experience of those nearest to her. The servants occasionally shared their unease in letters or private notes. Descriptions of the odour, the rigidity of fabric, and the reluctance to wash appear in scattered records that have remained. These records show how the customs of one woman could impose difficulty on many others. In a palace where everything sparkled with wealth, the most basic duty became a burden of smell and stainless steel. It's crucial to remember that undergarments weren't simply fabric. In that period, they were regarded as personal and intimate, connected to modesty and decency. To manage them without permission was to cross a boundary, yet in this instance, the servants were ordered to do so routinely. The paradox was the items were both sacred and disgusting, untouchable, yet constantly touched. The Queen's authority turned them into symbols of domination, leaving those beneath her with no voice to resist. The undergarments that stuck to Victoria's body transported sweat marks and smell, yet they were maintained with a care that made no sense outside the palace. They became the silent burden of those who folded and stored them, a responsibility executed in obedience rather than reason. But the air of her rooms held more than the smell of fabric, for even the very bed where she rested became heavy with something no servant could ever forget. The private rooms of Queen Victoria were enclosed spaces, isolated against the outside world. The bed at the centre of her chamber was large and heavy, surrounded by thick drapes that prevented the flow of air. These drapes were pulled tightly, transforming the bed into an enclosed compartment. The conviction was that drafts of cold air could bring sickness, so windows were seldom opened and air circulation was almost non-existent. Inside such conditions, smells didn't escape, but remained. The outcome was a constant thickness in the room, a blend of smells that no servant could fully articulate, yet none could overlook. The bedding itself was seldom washed. Sheets might be switched after long periods, but the heavier materials, such as the mattress or the padded cover underneath, were left untouched for months at a stretch. Sweat absorbed into them night after night, and over time the layers soaked up more than fabric was intended to contain. When a servant came near the bed to straighten it, the smell would emerge, catching in the throat and making breathing challenging. It's almost absurd that a queen who valued dignity permitted her bed to become something closer to a basement of damp cloth than a place of rest. Yet this was recognised as normal within the palace because it was her order. The chamber was designed with luxury in consideration, but the materials of luxury only intensified the problem. Velvet, brocade and heavy wool held on to smells. The thick curtains and rugs trapped every trace of stale air. Without circulation, the scent became more intense each week. Dust gathered over everything, but the real presence was the invisible layer of sweat oils, an exhaled breath that accumulated without release. The mixture created an environment described by one servant as something that stuck to the throat. This description conveys the suffocating quality of the space, not just unpleasant, but crushing. For those who laboured inside, it became a responsibility to endure. Servants couldn't protest, though they felt the pressure of the air each time they entered. They maintained the rituals of smoothing sheets, adjusting drapes, and sprinkling perfumes at the edges of the bed. But the perfumes only blended with the smells, concealing nothing. The scents of flowers and oils combined with perspiration and dust, creating a fragrance that was stranger, not cleaner. If the same conditions were duplicated today, it would be like sealing a bedroom with plastic curtains and never washing the sheets while spraying air freshener each morning, as if that resolved the problem. From a distance, the chamber would appear rich and maintained, but inside it was another story. Victoria herself recognised this as part of her existence. She saw no threat in leaving the bedding untouched, thinking that the body's natural strength could overcome discomfort. To her, drafts of fresh air were a bigger risk than stale air, so windows remained closed. She believed in endurance, not indulgence, and thought that changing sheets too frequently weakened the spirit. What might appear like carelessness to us was to her discipline. It was another example of how her personal concepts of hygiene overruled both counsel and common sense. The servants carried the consequences. They executed their work with cloths tied at their necks or hands held near their faces. Some documented in letters that the odour remained on their clothing long after departing the chamber. The smell became part of their existence, remaining on their skin and hair. They recognised it as part of their responsibility, but privately they were disturbed. I find it unsettling to picture walking into such a room with drapes closed, air motionless, and fabric heavy with years of perspiration, while being expected to treat it as a place of dignity. The image is less royal than it is suffocating. The problem wasn't limited to the bed. The whole chamber absorbed what the bed expelled. Thick rugs beneath upholstered chairs nearby, and drapes that stretched from ceiling to floor all transported the same weight of smell. When visitors walked in, they may have noticed, but said nothing. Etiquette required silence. Within the court, the truth about the Queen's bedroom was left unmentioned. Yet everyone close to her knew the clash was severe. Britain was viewed as a leader of progress, innovation and influence, but its ruler existed in rooms that resisted the simplest forms of cleanliness. In public, she was an image of discipline. In private, her environment carried the signs of carelessness. The difference between appearance and reality was harsh. And yet the system of service, respect and fear guaranteed that no change happened. Reports from those years mention that servants occasionally sprinkled vinegar on rags and positioned them near the bed to dull the odour. Others lit candles or burned herbs to shift the air. But these were temporary solutions. Nothing eliminated the core problem, which was that the bed itself and the drapes around it were never given the treatment they required. The palace kept functioning as if all was fine. The Queen kept sleeping in the same conditions. The environment in her rooms became part of the unspoken burdens of palace existence. It demonstrated how personal routines of one woman could affect the daily existence of many others. Servants learned to breathe lightly, to remain as brief as possible, and to exit the chamber as soon as responsibilities were completed. For them, it was a reminder that service meant silence, even in the presence of discomfort. The bed remained a private world, protected by drapes and unquestioned by counsel. Its smells were the secret weight carried by the walls of the palace, a hidden truth behind the splendour of public rituals. It's here that the distance between royal image and private routine is felt most clearly. The heavy air of Victoria's bedroom wasn't only a matter of physical discomfort, but of symbolic significance. It represented the persistence of old fears and old practices, even as the world advanced forward. In the silence of those rooms, the progress of an empire was left outside the entrance, while inside, the Queen clung to customs that belonged more to the past than to the present. Victoria's chamber, with its thick drapes and untouched bedding, became a room of stale air, a place where even the strongest servant struggled to remain. The odour that stuck to the throat was a constant presence, a daily reminder of how power could reshape the simplest truths of cleanliness. The Queen viewed it as discipline and protection, but those who entered knew it as suffocation. The sealed chamber of Victoria was heavy with smells, its drapes and bedding trapping the breath of years. Servants tolerated it silently, while perfumes and herbs failed to alter its nature. Yet beneath the bed, and concealed from sight, lay something even more disturbing. A vessel of waste that shaped her nights more powerfully than any curtain or sheet. Beneath the bed of Queen Victoria rested an object that shaped the private reality of her nights. A chamber pot without a cover. It was positioned directly under the heavy frame of the bed, close enough that she could utilize it whenever she needed to during the dark hours. The pot wasn't covered, not emptied during the night, and not treated with any substance to minimize the odor. Each morning a servant was expected to remove it, but until then its contents stayed in the closed air of her bedroom. The smells seeped into the drapes, rugs and thick fabrics of the chamber. By the time the sun emerged, the smell had already become part of the space, impossible to eliminate. The chamber pot was porcelain, plain in shape and heavy. Once filled without a cover, it stood open to the air, releasing a constant presence that grew stronger as the hours went by. It was positioned as if it were part of the furnishings, recognized as normal within her daily existence. The absence of shame or privacy in this practice was remarkable in a household that projected splendor and formality. The Queen herself permitted her most private waste to rest in the same chamber where she slept. It's almost darkly amusing to picture the symbol of an empire sleeping just above a pot of waste that nobody dared mention. The servants assigned with removing it followed strict directions. They were instructed not to look too closely, not to inhale deeply, and to transport the pot away with as much silence as possible. It was to be emptied each morning, cleaned lightly, and returned to its place for the next night. No matter how unpleasant the task was executed without question. Servants learned to hold their breath, move swiftly, and treat the pot as if it were simply another royal object. Their discomfort was insignificant compared to the responsibility of obedience. The odour didn't disappear when the pot was transported out. By then, it had already infiltrated the thick velvet drapes, absorbed into the rugs, and stuck to the walls. Candles, incense, and perfumes were utilised to soften it, but none of these methods worked completely. Instead, the scents stacked on top of one another, creating a heavy environment that was neither fresh nor pleasant. Visitors might not have been able to recognise the source, but they felt the thickness in the air. If such a practice existed today, it would be like a world leader maintaining an open toilet under their bed and asking staff to disregard the odour until morning. The concept is difficult to accept, yet in the palace it was simply custom. For Victoria, the convenience outweighed any thought of cleanliness. She disliked the concept of walking through cold halls to a lavatory at night, and she mistrusted the new flushing toilets that were being introduced. She claimed the sound of rushing water disrupted dignity and discipline. So the pot remained her preferred option, an object of daily necessity that transported with it the weight of carelessness. To her, it was practical. To everyone else, it was something they tolerated in silence. The servants' experiences were documented in occasional writings, though not in official records. One noted that lifting the pot was like transporting a piece of the night itself, heavy and unavoidable. Someone else described how the scent stayed on their skin regardless of how thoroughly they scrubbed. These accounts exposed the weight that accompanied closeness to the monarch. It wasn't simply work, but the accommodation of circumstances that would have been inconceivable anywhere else. I'm troubled picturing myself in that situation, instructed to hold my breath while transporting refuse that had permeated carpets valued at enormous sums. The disparity between opulence and actuality couldn't have been more pronounced. The chamber vessel became woven into the character of her sleeping quarters. There it signified more than mere practicality. It demonstrated how individual convictions and anxieties superseded emerging innovations. While fellow Britons gradually embraced contemporary plumbing, she stood firm against it. Her dismissal of modern facilities was simultaneously metaphorical and functional. Metaphorical in that it revealed her suspicion of transformation. Functional in that it burdened her attendants with a recurring responsibility of managing refuse in a manner that dispersed stench across the residence. The vessel's existence influenced the broader surroundings. Floor coverings under the sleeping furniture became drenched with the scent. Eventually, no degree of maintenance could eliminate it entirely. The atmosphere in the space never felt crisp, even following brief intervals when windows were cracked open. The intensity of the stink became woven into residential existence, tolerated by visitors and disregarded by authority. It stood as yet another illustration of how influence shielded the monarch from repercussions while abandoning others to manage. The inconsistency stayed apparent in the particulars of her leadership. She represented a personality who embodied structure, restraint, and ethical fortitude. Still, her personal sleeping quarters exposed a hidden realm of abandonment. The exposed vessel under the furniture symbolized the gap between the outward projection of advancement and the internal tolerance of squalor. The nation progressed in manufacturing, knowledge, and colonial reach, but its monarch held fast to a custom that originated from an older era. The discrepancy was glaring, and it influenced the routine encounters of everyone in her service. The vessel was transported out each dawn, cleared and brought back. The pattern recurred daily, unaltered across years. It evolved into a cadence of residential existence. A minor gesture that exposed a more significant reality. The stink never genuinely dissipated. The attendants never protested audibly. The monarch never reconsidered her position. Victoria's chamber vessel remained under her furniture, evening after evening, an item lacking a lid that saturated her quarters with stench and her staff with apprehension. It characterized the concealed truth of her quarters, reminding everyone who stepped inside that influence could justify even the most disagreeable practices. Still past the furniture and its concealed vessel, her customs reached further, affecting the precise manner she maintained her physical form from crown to sole. And regarding her hair, the methods she adhered to brought their own blend of peculiarity and unease. The monarch's hair stood among her most apparent characteristics in paintings and official functions. Yet the manner she maintained it privately exposed methods distant from the refined presentation. She opposed the application of cleansers and washing agents, worrying that such preparations would harm her scalp and trigger her hair to diminish. Rather, she depended on a blend of eggs, animal tallow, and dark ale. Such components were typical in traditional domestic treatments, but in her situation they transformed into a permanent replacement for any contemporary cleaning approach. The blend was dispensed into her hair, massaged through, and subsequently allowed to remain before being lightly rinsed with water or removed with fabric. Instead of producing fresh hair, the outcome was frequently weighted, oily, and subtly acidic with the scent of brewing. The regularity of this cleaning was minimal. She received hair treatment this way roughly once monthly, occasionally even more infrequently. Among treatments, the oils and deposits accumulated, causing her hair to merge into strands that adhered to her scalp. The scent was evident to those labouring beside her, a subtle smell of fermentation and aged fat that demanded acknowledgement. It borders on absurd to picture an imperial leader featured in paintings with hair that had been soaked in ale and beast fat, then combed through as though that constituted a hallmark of refinement. Still in the residence, this practice was accommodated without dispute. The implements she employed for maintenance reflected identical abandonment. Her combs and brushes were constructed from silver, elaborate and costly, yet they were never adequately maintained. They were merely wiped with soiled fabric following application, abandoning traces of oil and deposits. Across time, these implements grew tarnished and tacky, retaining the scent of the materials worked into her hair. Attendants managed them cautiously, as they were precious items, but they transported with them the proof of extended abandonment. The scent of her hair occupied her sleeping quarters during treatment. The blend of egg yolk and ale discharged an acidic smell that attached to textiles and drapery. The fat deposited oily stains on bedding and towels, rendering them challenging to re-employ. Following each treatment, the attendants ventilated the space as effectively as possible, but with windows seldom opened, the atmosphere stayed thick. Fragrances were sprinkled on her hair and dispersed in the space. Yet this merely introduced another coating of scent without eliminating the initial one. If this practice occurred presently, it would resemble someone demanding to cleanse their hair with dairy fat and aged ale once monthly, then grooming it with implements that had never encountered cleanser. The parallel displays plainly how unusual this custom would seem in any contemporary context. For Victoria, these approaches were not gestures of abandonment, but of maintenance. She maintained that rejecting harsh cleansers protected her inherent vitality and that customary treatments preserved her hair dense. She placed confidence in established customs beyond novel preparations. The oily consistency and persistent smell were indicators to her that the treatment was effective. Attendants might have perceived it otherwise, but they possessed no alternative except to execute the procedure she required. The presentation of her hair publicly was controlled, meticulously styled into rigid configurations, concealed with veils or positioned under crowns. The oil and smell were obscured from observation. What the public observed was a monarch with disciplined hair, an emblem of control. What the attendant observed was entirely different. A head of hair layered with materials that attached and fermented across time. The discrepancy between projection and actuality was stark, and once more it was the personnel who absorbed the discomfort. I'm disturbed picturing standing beyond her seat, grooming through strands that adhered together with fat, while recognizing that the brush itself hadn't been cleaned in months. The responsibility would have been more disagreeable than formal. Her opposition to washing agents and contemporary cleaning substances was another illustration of how individual belief superseded guidance. As newer preparations became accessible in the 19th century, certain physicians and advocates championed them as superior options. Yet the monarch rejected such guidance, favouring what she considered to be safer and more organic to her. Beast fat and ale were dependable, recognisable and verified. To others, they were reminders of established customs that declined to disappear. The results of these practices stretched past scent. Accumulation on the scalp could trigger irritation, flaking and contamination. Still, these difficulties were rationalized as minor disturbances or as organic consequences of aging. Nobody proposed that her approaches might be the source. The monarch's declaration overruled perception, and her customs persisted unaltered. Attendants adjusted by tolerating the smell, maintaining separation when feasible, and cleaning up the disorder left behind. The hair ceremonies aligned with a broader tendency of her existence. They displayed the identical suspicion of water, the identical opposition to emerging innovations, and the identical conviction in restraint through discomfort. Precisely as she rejected bathing, she rejected cleanser for her hair. Precisely as she rested above an exposed chamber vessel, she displayed her hair with the deposits of ale and oil. The customs were uniform, and collectively they influenced the surroundings of the residents. For the attendants, these ceremonies were a weight of quietness. They transported bowls of ale and fat, worked them into her scalp, and groomed through the strands that merged together. They subsequently transported away towels and fabrics drenched with oil, recognizing the smell would persist on their skin. This was their routine actuality, obscured from the public gaze but permanent to those who experienced it. Victoria's hair treatments produced oily strands, acidic smells, and implements that never received adequate cleaning. To her, it was vitality and custom. To those surrounding her, it was another manifestation of abandonment enclosed in power. The reality of her hair maintenance methods exposes how influence could convert individual customs into unquestionable regulation. Her hair layered in fat and ale transported the smell of traditional treatments and the burden of abandonment. Attendants groomed and arranged it into discipline, but under the crowns and veils the actuality stayed. And if her hair appeared disagreeable, the manner she handled her mouth exposed something even more concerning, for even her teeth were never maintained in the manner we might anticipate. The manner the monarch maintained her teeth was as peculiar as her remaining customs. She opposed toothbrushes, maintaining that the bristles could dislodge her teeth and trigger them to detach. This worry was typical enough in her period when oral maintenance was inadequately comprehended, but she extended it past most. Rather than brushing, she cleaned her teeth with fabrics dipped in potent alcohol. Brandy or whiskey was worked into the fabric, and she massaged it softly across her forward teeth, preventing anything that might abrade or compress too forcefully. The ceremony provided her a perception of cleanliness without genuinely cleaning anything. Food fragments, discolorations, and microorganisms were abandoned unaddressed in the spaces. The outcome was an impression of maintenance that obscured deterioration under the exterior. The scent of her breath was a persistent existence. The alcohol didn't eliminate smell, but contributed to it, blending with the remnants of food positioned between her teeth. In the mornings, her breath transmitted the scent of metal, alcohol, and decomposed meat. Attendants and intimate assistants who needed to position near her detected it. Though nobody spoke audibly, they tolerated it in quietness, suspending their breath when required and waiting until they could withdraw. It borders on paradoxical that a monarch encircled by fragrances and premium fabrics transported a mouth that smelled more resembling a drinking establishment than a residence. The fabrics she employed for cleaning were frequently the identical ones maintained beside her bedside or grooming surface. They were not consistently cleaned among applications, merely wrung out and abandoned to dry. Across time, they hardened with alcohol and deposits. This indicated that the precise implement intended to maintain her teeth was itself unclean. When she compressed it to her mouth, she distributed aged discolorations and microorganisms instead of eliminating them. The conviction that alcohol itself was adequate to eliminate microorganisms maintained her persuaded that she was defended, though the reality was different. Her consumption merely intensified the difficulty. Substantial meats, dense sauces, and sugary desserts attached to her teeth. Without brushing, these remnants solidified into accumulations along her gums. The alcohol couldn't eliminate them, and consequently, they accumulated across time. This triggered inflammation, bleeding, and discomfort, but these were rationalized as organic consequences of aging. The genuine source, abandonment of adequate maintenance, was never acknowledged. If a leader presently declined to employ a toothbrush and rather dabbed at their teeth with whiskey, it would trigger astonishment and mockery across the globe. In her period, nevertheless, the quietness of those surrounding her defended her from condemnation. Dental practitioners were summoned to examine her periodically, but their labour was restricted. They were not authorised to abrade her teeth or investigate too intensely. She mistrusted their implements, maintaining that metal instruments could damage her vitality and essence. Consequently, they could accomplish scarcely more than examine her from separation and deliver courteous observations. When discomfort grew too intense, teeth were occasionally extracted, but no genuine prevention was ever undertaken. The monarch rejected anything that seemed intrusive, even when it signified permitting deterioration to advance. Attendants who assisted her meals were the initial to detect the state of her mouth. Fragments of food frequently adhered between her teeth and stayed there until she cleaned them with her fabric. The cleaning was never complete. Minor fragments stayed and decomposed, gradually contributing to the smell of her breath. Positioning beside her throughout meals evolved into a difficulty, but nobody voiced objections. Protocol required quietness, and the influence of her existence required compliance. I'm unsettled picturing leaning near to assist her, compelled to inhale atmosphere thick with alcohol and decomposition while feigning that nothing was incorrect. Victoria maintained firmly in restraint, and her opposition to toothbrushes was presented as another gesture of vitality to her. Brushing was unnecessary, an excess invented by others. She placed confidence in the sensation of alcohol as verification of cleanliness, persuaded that what burned must simultaneously purify. This conviction provided her assurance, but it abandoned her mouth in a condition that merely deteriorated with time. Attendants adjusted, dental practitioners were quieted, and the practice persisted year following year. The residents adjusted similarly. Fragrances and perfumed fabrics were maintained nearby to mask the smells that persisted following meals. Spaces were ventilated more frequently than typical following her dinners, though without clarification visitors detected minimal because protocol maintained them at separation. It was those in her nearest circle who experienced most. Positioned between obligation and discomfort, her opposition to brushing aligned flawlessly with her remaining customs. Precisely as she rejected bathing and cleaning her hair adequately, she rejected the toothbrush. Precisely as her chamber vessel was abandoned exposed, her mouth was abandoned unaddressed. The tendency was evident. Individual belief was more powerful than knowledge, and custom was more powerful than advancement. These customs characterized her existence and influenced the routine practices of those surrounding her. The results grew apparent across the years, her teeth tarnished, fractured and shattered, several detached, producing spaces that transformed her speech. Still, even subsequently, she didn't embrace adequate cleaning. She depended on her fabrics and alcohol, maintaining them to be adequate. The reality was evident to those surrounding her, but reality was ineffective confronting royal directive. Victoria's decline to brush produced a mouth that smelled of alcohol, metal and aged food, masked merely by fragrances and quietness. Attendants tolerated it routinely. Dental practitioners remained ineffective, and she stayed persuaded of her personal restraint. To the colonial realm, she was an emblem of vitality. To those near to her, she was a woman whose customs revealed abandonment beyond grandeur. Her teeth, cleaned with fabric and alcohol but never brushed, transported the proof of years of abandonment. The scent of her breath advanced through her quarters, an existence as potent as any fragrance. And if her mouth appeared concerning, the manner she managed the most basic of items, her handkerchiefs exposed another coating of customs that troubled those who existed surrounding her. Among the minor items that escorted the monarch each day, her handkerchiefs distinguished themselves not for their attractiveness, but for the manner she employed them. In most residences, it was typical to exchange handkerchiefs routinely, particularly among the prosperous, who could manage an abundance of pristine fabric. For her, nevertheless, the identical piece of fabric might be employed recurrently for 7 days, or beyond. The handkerchief fulfilled numerous functions. It was compressed against her face to absorb perspiration, elevated to her nose when she sniffled and massaged along her neck to capture oil. The fabric gathered powder that descended from her skin, particles from her garments, and discolorations from whatever it contacted. Across time, the fabric grew rigid and faded, still it stayed part of her routine practice. These handkerchiefs were constructed of premium linen or cotton, occasionally decorated with lace, but their caliber accomplished minimal to diminish the disagreeableness of recurrent application. Once moistened with perspiration or particles, they were suspended over the headboard of her furniture or positioned on a proximate surface to dry. Subsequently, they were employed again without cleaning. The outcome was a piece of fabric that retained coating upon coating of deposits. It borders on ridiculous to visualize the monarch of the British colonial realm re-employing a handkerchief rigid with perspiration and powder, as though premium lace could convert dirt into something tolerable. Attendants were directed not to substitute the fabrics unless provided authorization. They might arrange them tidily or relocate them to another position, but they were not to cleanse them without her directive. This indicated that the identical handkerchief could circulate through her routine existence until the smell grew apparent. Even subsequently, substitution was not assured. The monarch possessed her personal perception of sequence and discipline, and her personnel executed it without objection. The scent of these fabrics contributed to the already substantial atmosphere of her quarters. Suspended beside her furniture, they discharged smells into the atmosphere throughout the evening. When she retrieved them again in the dawn, the moisture returned to her skin. The mixture of perspiration, powder and particles rendered them simultaneously disagreeable and unsanitary. Still to her, they were an indication of practicality, a custom that didn't require persistent attention. If a contemporary leader presently demanded to employ the identical handkerchief for a complete week, transporting it from the sleeping quarters to official occasions, it would be a controversy within hours. In her period, quietness rendered it undetectable to everyone but her nearest assistants. For the attendants, managing these fabrics was another responsibility contributed to their weight. They arranged them, ventilated them, and positioned them back within grasp. The smell attached to their skin, particularly when the fabrics had been substantially employed. Certain attendants observed privately that the discolorations and rigidity rendered the fabric disagreeable to contact. Still, compliance was demanded. Objections could signify termination, and consequently quietness dominated. I'm disturbed picturing elevating a handkerchief discoloured with perspiration and compressed recurrently against a face, merely to arrange it meticulously, as though it were a treasured possession. This visualization captures the inconsistency between royal prosperity and individual abandonment. The existence of these fabrics reflected beyond individual selection. They displayed how even the most basic standards of cleanliness could be disregarded when reinforced by power. A handkerchief is a minor item, but in its recurrent application, it evolved into an emblem of the broader customs of the monarch. Her reluctance to substitute or cleanse them paralleled her rejection of bathing, hair cleaning, and oral maintenance. It was component of a uniform tendency, one in which comfort and conviction superseded sanitation and knowledge. The fabrics similarly transported functional dangers. Fabric touched her skin again and again, damp and heavy with use, spreading irritation where it pressed against her face and neck. Bacteria flourished in the creases, and every time she brought them back to her skin, she pushed those germs deeper. This likely worsened the skin troubles she endured from time to time, though no one ever connected the dirty handkerchiefs to her discomfort. The link between soiled cloth and inflamed skin went unspoken. The Queen placed faith in her patterns, and the people surrounding her lacked the authority to question her methods. Throughout the culture of the 1800s, handkerchiefs held symbolic weight. They represented sophistication, frequently stitched with detail and shown as signs of position. For Victoria, though, their symbolic importance conflicted with their actual condition. What ought to have served as a marker of grace turned into another case of practices that went against her outward appearance. Visitors, who noticed her carrying lace-edged fabric, saw refinement, never imagining how many days those pieces had been carried. The continuation of this pattern once more shows the gap between what the public saw and what happened behind closed doors. In view of others, she embodied structure, virtue, and advancement. Away from eyes, she lived as someone who kept using handkerchiefs until they turned rigid with build-up. The contrast stayed concealed through quiet acceptance, proper behaviour, and submission. No one beyond her private rooms could learn the truth, and those working inside possessed no ability to reveal it. The handkerchiefs of Queen Victoria meant more than simple material. They served as everyday items that soaked up the traces of her existence and sent them into her living space. They represented silent markers of carelessness, permitted because of her position, accepted because of her significance. Her handkerchiefs brought back day upon day collected perspiration, cosmetic powder, and stale smells, shifting from fabric into vehicles of disregard. Workers folded and returned them without questioning, while the atmosphere in her quarters became thicker with their existence. And though these pieces of cloth troubled the ones who touched them, another practice within the residence sparked even deeper discomfort, one that concerned not the Queen directly, but the workers who attempted to stay fresh while serving her. The workers who existed and performed their duties inside the residence found themselves bound by the practices of Queen Victoria as firmly as by her command. Their everyday patterns took shape not simply through obligation, but through the personal convictions of the Queen as well. One of the most obvious instances of this occurred when a young housemaid lost her position because she washed herself too frequently. She had developed the routine of bathing each dawn, a practice that appeared normal or perhaps commendable. Rather, it received judgment as offensive. The Queen objected that the housemaid brought the scent of cleansing products wherever she moved, and that this scent proved disagreeable and unneeded. For Victoria, the authentic smell of human flesh deserved appreciation, whereas the produced aroma of soap seemed intrusive. This conviction reversed the usual understanding of being clean. where most homes, particularly among those with means, supported regular washing as evidence of cultivation. In Victoria's residence, the reverse held true. Being clean past what the Queen maintained for herself proved unwelcome. To wash too regularly meant risking disapproval, possibly termination. It borders on absurd to picture a residence overflowing with riches where a worker might be dismissed simply for carrying the smell of soap. Still, this described the actual conditions of existence within her staff. The removal of the housemaid carried significance beyond the moment. It turned into a caution for the rest. Workers rapidly understood that restraint in bathing proved necessary if they wished to preserve their employment. Washing too often could brand them as defiant or disrespectful. Effectively, the Queen's individual practices turned into regulation for all who existed close to her. Workers stayed away from soap and water beyond what they otherwise might have. Anxious about drawing notice for improper reasons, the conviction that natural smells held nobility spread to the broader surroundings of the residence. Victoria maintained that the scent of flesh, unaltered by soaps and fragrances, stood for genuineness. She rejected manufactured scents, apart from when applied sparingly to hide unavoidable smells in her quarters. For her, the presence of the body signified honesty. To workers, though, it demanded the suppression of their individual standards of ease. They faced pressure to adopt the Queen's interpretation of being clean into their personal existence. The results showed themselves plainly. A residence already thick with stagnant air and unwashed material grew even harder to bear when those labouring within it rejected soap. The smell of exertion and toil attached itself to uniforms, protective coverings, and flesh. The attempt to satisfy the Queen produced surroundings where natural smells gathered, rendering the space oppressive. If a workplace now required that staff members refuse soap and disciplined them for smelling fresh, it would provoke anger and court action within hours. In the 1800s, inside the Queen's residence, it received acceptance through quiet. For the workers directly, the dismissal of the housemaid brought both terror and shame. They witnessed a co-worker disciplined for a practice that numerous among them quietly desired they could follow each day. Bathing remained uncommon among those without money, not through preference, but through requirement. To discover themselves in a residence and restricted from bettering their individual practices seemed like bitter contradiction. Rather than providing improved circumstances, royal employment frequently demanded giving up the limited comforts they could have obtained. I consider it troubling to picture being in that situation, understanding that a basic action of bathing might be considered a violation serious enough to terminate a livelihood. The authority of one individual's taste exceeded logic, ease, and wellness. This dismissal further demonstrated the friction between contemporary progress and traditional convictions. The 1800s represented a time of swift innovation, featuring developments in sanitation. Public welfare advocates encouraged washing as crucial to stopping sickness. Still at the exact heart of the empire, the Queen rejected these concepts. Her power reached well past her individual staff, influencing opinions toward being clean among those who regarded her as an example. The contradiction proved severe. As Britain took satisfaction in advancement, its ruler held tight to a picture of earlier times. The atmosphere of dread that developed in her residence strengthened submission. Workers no longer viewed bathing as an individual decision. It turned into a danger. They rejected water, limited their application of soap, and adopted patterns that reflected the Queen's practices. What could have been individual taste in another household turned into a firm directive in hers. The termination of one housemaid guaranteed that the others would comply. The residents directly showed the evidence of this approach. Hallways and quarters bore the burden of natural smells that never received full concealment. Garments turned musty with greater speed. The atmosphere stayed dense and unrefreshed. Still, no one brought up the matter openly. To challenge the Queen's practices meant questioning her command, something no worker could risk. Quiet once more proved more powerful than reality. The housemaid who faced dismissal vanished from the documentation of the residence. Her account endured solely in the testimonies of others who recalled the events. She turned into a representation of the restrictions imposed on those who worked there. Her outcome cautioned all that even the tiniest aspects of cleanliness might be deemed improper. From that moment forward, the statement became evident. The Queen's convictions took priority, and ease or wellness came afterward. Victoria's rejection of soap and her discipline of those who applied it produced a residence where individual cleanliness faced limitation. Workers persevered, adjusted and suppressed their individual impulses. The Queen's perspective that natural smells held nobility turned into the controlling principle, influencing not simply her existence but the existence of all surrounding her. A housemaid dismissed for carrying the scent of soap demonstrated how authority reshaped the significance of being clean. Within the residence, her absence turned into a wordless instruction to others, strengthening disregard as control and natural smells as noble. Yet past the workers and their difficulties, Victoria's individual practices turned even more disturbing when examined during her intimate times of the month, when her flesh required attention that she declined to provide. The most intimate elements of Queen Victoria's existence followed the identical practices of disregard that characterised her everyday patterns. During her monthly occurrence, she failed to embrace approaches of attention that could have reduced smell or enhanced ease. Rather, she depended on thick material folded and held against her flesh to collect the discharge. These materials received no frequent replacement. They remained worn for a complete day or longer before receiving change, and the outcome proved an accumulation of blood and perspiration that rendered the material heavy and malodorous. Only at the conclusion of her occurrence did the materials get collected, cleaned, and returned to use. Until that time, they hung for drying in intimate rooms, sending smells that drifted quietly into the nearby atmosphere. The Queen considered this completely ordinary. To her, regular washing or changing proved unnecessary and possibly extravagant. She recognised no justification to disturb the flesh's natural pattern with what she judged excess. Still, the results of this pattern proved challenging to overlook. The bedding of her sleeping place turned stained and heavy with smell. The cushioning below, infrequently, if at all cleaned, soaked up these smells and retained them for months. Workers assigned to replacing the bedding detected the smell right away. It approaches comedy that a residence adorned with precious metals and precious stones held a sleeping place that carried less resemblance to royalty and greater resemblance to an abandoned sick chamber. The materials directly proved coarse and challenging to clean. After staining, heating or scrubbing rendered them rigid, yet they still returned to use. When suspended for drying in her quarters, they sent out a sharp metallic smell that attached to window coverings and floor coverings. Workers who touched them received instructions not to remark, though numerous found the assignment deeply disagreeable. Transporting the materials meant transporting the smell, which occasionally pursued them well after they departed her rooms. They accepted this obligation in quiet, as refusal or objection would have received treatment as defiance. The existence of these materials in her intimate room influenced the surroundings. Mixed with unwashed bedding and sealed windows, the smell turned challenging to hide. Fragrances received use to conceal it, yet these solely added another level to the dense atmosphere. Visitors who came never accessed such intimate spaces, therefore they stayed unaware. The Queen directly accepted the circumstance as existence. To her, it represented a natural occurrence, demanding no greater notice than the occasional drying of material. If such practices occurred now, it would resemble someone refusing all contemporary sanitary items and rather leaving stained material to dry in their sleeping chamber for days, continuously. The picture clarifies how distant her practices stood from anything we might judge ordinary. For the workers, this portion of their labour proved possibly the most challenging. They faced requirements not simply to touch stained materials, but further to clean the sleeping place after the occurrence concluded. The bedding received washing infrequently, the cushioning never. They removed linens that carried strong smells of blood and perspiration, understanding that substantial smell would stay in the bedding below. These assignments, completed without recognition or compensation, reminded them each day that royal employment meant accepting what remained unspoken. I consider it profoundly unsettling to picture standing in such a room with stained materials suspended for drying and a sleeping place heavy with smell while facing requirements to regard it all as ordinary. The wellness dangers of these practices proved genuine. Extended contact with unwashed materials might produce infection and inflammation. The mixture of perspiration and bacteria raised the danger further. Still, this went unrecognised. Medical guidance at the period provided minimal improvement, and the Queen's individual opposition to regular washing indicated that reform proved unattainable. She placed trust in her individual assessment beyond the recommendations of physicians, and therefore the practices proceeded unchanged. The residence, heavy with luxurious materials and dense floor coverings, turned into a trap for these smells. Different from stone or timber, material soaked up and retained the smells of her patterns. Window coverings suspended near her sleeping place, floor coverings underfoot and padding in her intimate rooms all bore traces of her occurrence. This produced a background smell that workers understood thoroughly, yet outsiders seldom experienced. The difference between the luxury of the residence and the actuality of its smells served as another reminder of the distance between appearance and reality. The Queen's dependence on material, instead of more regular changes, demonstrated her conviction in persistence. She regarded discomfort as an examination of fortitude. Similarly to how she rejected water and tooth-cleaning implements, she rejected what she perceived as excess in this most intimate area. To her, control meant opposing ease, regardless if that ease meant wellness and being clean. The contradiction proved that her demand for control produced circumstances of disregard. For those who laboured near her, this control meant extended days in dense atmosphere. They obeyed directives, transported materials, and tolerated the surroundings. They possessed no authority to modify the patterns. Their quiet permitted the practices to continue, similarly to how it had with all other elements of her cleanliness. Victoria's occurrences managed with materials that received infrequent changing and infrequent washing produced smells that attached to her sleeping place, her quarters and her workers. To her, this represented existence. To those surrounding her, it represented another weight to tolerate in quiet. The opposition between riches and disregard reached its sharpest point. The Queen's menstrual practices rendered her bedding stained, her quarters heavy with smell, and her workers with assignments that no one desired yet all had to complete. She tolerated these patterns with satisfaction in her control, certain they demonstrated fortitude. Still past the monthly rituals of material and bedding, another practice demonstrated how disregard reached even to the garments she carried in public view. Garments that held against her flesh until they developed mould with perspiration. The corset represented one of the characteristic garments of Queen Victoria's presentation, a representation of the firm control and structure that she appreciated so deeply. Carried tightly against her flesh, it formed her waist into the stylish narrow shape praised in her period. Yet behind the refined surface of gowns and precious stones, the corset brought with it circumstances of disregard that rendered everyday existence uncomfortable. The interior covering soaked up perspiration and oils each day held firmly against her skin without relief. These coverings received no washing or replacement regularly. Rather, they stayed in position for weeks, retaining the moisture of her flesh and permitting smells and fungus to develop. The The constriction of the corset indicated that perspiration failed to evaporate readily. The material remained damp, particularly during extended ceremonies or warm periods. Through time, the dampness resulted in mildew that provided the garment a sharp smell. Workers who assisted her dressing detected this smell as they constricted the fastenings, yet none mentioned it. They merely executed their obligation, drawing the cords until the Queen's waist received binding once more. It approaches absurdity that the most authoritative woman of her period carried herself confidently in garments that smelled of mildew and perspiration, all for the sake of style. The impact on her skin proved substantial. Steady pressure mixed with captured moisture produced rashes and inflammation along her abdomen and upper legs. Red marks stayed well after the corset received removal. At evening, certain documentation describes sores that formed from extended wear, yet these received dismissal as the natural outcome of control. Victoria directly considered the discomfort served as evidence of her fortitude. She regarded the pain and inflammation as the required price of preserving the form required by her period. The corset received proper cleaning seldom. Washing would have diminished the rigid materials, and therefore, rather it received brief airing before receiving wear once more. This airing accomplished minimal removal of the smell or the stains. The garment turned darker with application, and the smell intensified. Workers folded materials or applied fragrances nearby, yet these actions solely covered the actuality. When the corset received lacing back onto her flesh, the smell returned completely. If a leader now demanded wearing the identical unwashed garment each day for weeks, held tightly against the skin until it developed mould, it would prove unimaginable. Still in the residence, the corset received treatment as a tool of worth. The procedure of applying the corset proved demanding itself. Workers drew the fastenings until the garment pressed deeply into her skin, compressing her waist and limiting her breathing. Mixed with the unwashed material, this produced an oppressive physical sensation. The Queen tolerated it each day, certain that the visible form it provided her flesh justified the price. To her, the discomfort strengthened her sense of control. To her workers, it represented another assignment to complete in quiet. Through time, the corset produced lasting marks on her flesh, discoloration of the skin, sores that required time to mend, and steady redness proved common. These troubles never received connection to disregard of being clean, but instead to the character of the garment directly. The notion that washing or replacing the covering could have assisted went unconsidered. Rather, the pain received framing as noble. I consider it unsettling to picture a ruler standing in grand ceremonies, praised for her form, while below the gown her skin proved raw and burning from a corset that had gone unwashed for weeks. The opposition between presentation and actuality proved severe. To the public, the corset represented refinement and structure. To those within the residence, it served as a source of smell and discomfort. Workers who assisted her dressing could detect the mildew and observe the marks on her skin, yet their quiet proved mandatory. The corset stayed a tool of command, both for the Queen directly and for the appearance she displayed to the world. The residence surroundings intensified the trouble. Heavy materials of gowns arranged over the corset captured heat and moisture even more. During summer occasions, the smell of perspiration mixed with the mildew of the corset, producing a smell that occupied her intimate quarters. Fragrance containers received liberal use, yet they accomplished minimal concealment of the reality. The corset bore its individual persistent existence. The Queen's conviction in the requirement of the corset extended past style. To her, the control of carrying it each day strengthened her fortitude and self-command. She considered discomfort as evidence of persistence, converting pain into a type of satisfaction. This conviction provided no space for worry about being clean. The garment received appreciation for its symbolic significance, not its physical circumstance. Workers documented their discomfort in intimate writings. Certain described the effort needed to fasten the corset tightly each day. Others referenced the smell that rose from the material as they leaned near. These accounts demonstrate how disagreeable the assignment proved, though no objection received voice openly. Quiet maintained the Queen's command, even in matters as minor as a garment. The corset therefore turned into another instance of how authority converted disregard into control. What could have received consideration as careless in another household received framing as noble in hers. The unwashed material, the smell of mildew and the sores on her skin received acceptance as elements of her pattern. For the Queen, they served as reminders of fortitude. For her workers, they served as reminders of quiet. The corset of Queen Victoria soaked up perspiration, cultivated mildew, and held against her skin until it produced marks that never disappeared. It represented the gap between the appearance of refinement shown to the world and the actuality tolerated within the residence. The garment proved as much a confinement as it proved a representation of style. Her corset, heavy with perspiration and fungus, rendered her skin raw, yet her satisfaction remained. Workers constricted it each day, accepting the smell and the marks it produced behind. And if her garments appeared troubling, her most intimate cleanliness demonstrated an even harsher reality, for she declined to wash the portion of her flesh that most needed attention. Queen Victoria's opinions toward cleanliness influenced nearly all elements of her everyday existence, and nowhere proved this more apparent than in how she handled the most intimate spaces of her flesh. She maintained that washing those portions directly, with water, proved improper, nearly indecent, regardless when physicians recommended it. In her thinking, to touch too frequently or too completely represented a breach of worth and modesty. This conviction failed to diminish with age or medical guidance. It stayed firm during her reign. Rather than bathing in a manner that would have guaranteed being clean, she favoured wiping herself lightly with materials dipped in alcohol or scented liquids. These materials received pressing solely to the surface, never applied, with genuine focus on the elimination of dirt or bacteria. The action proved more about preserving her sense of correctness than about actual cleanliness. Physicians who attempted to counsel otherwise discovered themselves limited. Male physicians, particularly, received permission to examine her rarely. She rejected the idea of men, regardless professional physicians, receiving allowance near her intimate flesh. Permission received provisions solely under severely restricted circumstances, and regardless then, examinations received expectations to prove brief, with as minimal contact as achievable. The mistrust reached to medical implements as well. She declined examination instruments or other devices, regarding them as unneeded intrusions. In application, this indicated that chances for authentic medical attention proved nearly non-existent. Troubles that could have received detection or prevention early remained until they turned more serious. It approaches absurdity that the ruler of a vast empire might deny herself fundamental medical attention because she believed washing or examination would diminish her worth somehow. The result of her refusal proved the gradual accumulation of smells and bacteria. Without the regular application of water, perspiration and natural secretions gather, bacteria reproduce readily in the warmth of unwashed material and skin. This resulted in persistent smells that remained for years, soaked into all surrounding her. The bedding near her bore the smell. Window coverings and floor coverings near her quarters absorbed it as well. After absorption into thick materials, the smell received no easy elimination. Workers labouring in her rooms held full awareness of it, though they never attempted speaking of what they detected. Their quiet proved as much a regulation as their everyday assignments. Fragrance and scented materials received constant use to conceal the trouble. She favoured applying lavender or rose water on the materials, considering this to prove adequate. Yet fragrances solely arranged another scent over the deeper smell, never eliminating it. At times, this rendered the atmosphere heavier rather than fresher. Visitors who entered her intimate quarters remarked on the thickness of the atmosphere, though they seldom identified the source. For those who existed and laboured close to her, the cause proved obvious. The smell proved not temporary. It turned into a permanent element of the residents' surroundings. If such a pattern occurred now, it would resemble someone refusing all soap or water for their most intimate cleanliness and merely applying deodorant or fragrance over the smell each day. No one would judge that authentic being clean. The weight fell most heavily on the workers. They faced assignments with eliminating the material that she had applied for wiping and handling bedding that bore the strong, sharp smell. These assignments ranked among the most feared. The smell remained on their hands and garments after the labour finished. Workers frequently described in intimate writings the discomfort of folding such materials or transporting stained bedding, yet they never spoke openly. To remark on such matters would have received consideration as disrespectful. And disrespect might mean dismissal. I consider it troubling to picture being one of those attendants folding material, rigid with years of application and smell, powerless to express a word about what I detected or experienced. It captures the burden of quiet imposed by her command. The wellness dangers of her refusal proved substantial, though seldom recognised. Without correct washing, inflammation and infection proved nearly unavoidable. Medical understanding of the period failed to completely grasp bacteria, yet regardless fundamental observations showed the perils of disregard. Still, Victoria interpreted discomfort as something natural, an examination of persistence. If she experienced itching, inflammation, or regardless more serious symptoms, she regarded them as intimate weights instead of preventable results. Physicians, when permitted to observe, frequently discovered themselves powerless to demand changes. Her command exceeded their guidance. Victoria's opposition to intimate washing further demonstrated her broader worldview. She maintained that modesty represented one of the highest virtues. To her, modesty indicated rejecting unneeded touch, regardless by herself. What she labelled control proved in reality an excuse to oppose change. She took satisfaction in not surrendering to what she judged excessive focus on the flesh. Cleanliness received treatment as secondary to morality. This conviction influenced not simply her individual practices, but further the standards of those surrounding her. Workers faced expectations to adopt her example of restraint, and physicians faced expectations to adjust to her restrictions. The results extended past her individual wellness. The residents directly bore the mark of her decisions. Heavy window coverings, cushioned chairs, and dense floor coverings soaked up smells that originated not simply from her absence of washing, but from her other practices as well. Still, this particular smell proved particularly persistent. Workers applied incense and fragrances to cover it, yet they never achieved complete success. The residence, grand as it proved, bore the concealed reality of its ruler's intimate disregard. Testimonies that endure from workers and attendants show how powerfully her command enforced quiet. Certain noted privately that the Queen's linens and quarters bore smells that received no mistaking. Others documented the discomfort of labouring in such circumstances, yet these testimonies remained always secret. None would have attempted expressing such things. During employment, the Queen's tastes received treatment as unchallengeable regulation. Through time, the smell turned into element of the surroundings in a manner that no one might change. The refusal to wash, mixed with the refusal to permit medical examinations, rendered improvement unattainable. Workers persevered, physicians withdrew, and the Queen continued in her certainties. To her, it represented virtue. To others, it represented a weight. The difference between her public appearance as a representation of control and the actuality of her intimate disregard reached its greatest extent. Victoria's refusal to wash her most intimate spaces rendered her flesh with smells that extended into her surroundings, her workers with assignments that brought discomfort, and her physicians with boundaries they failed to cross. Her sense of modesty, framed as worth, produced the reverse impact. It converted her most intimate practices into certain of the most disturbing actualities of residents' existence. Her rejection of correct washing, defended as control, produced smells that attached to her flesh and her quarters. For years, workers tolerated the results in quiet while physicians remained at a distance, powerless to intervene. Yet one incident shattered the quiet when a physician who attempted to examine her failed to withstand the overwhelming smell and collapsed under the burden of it. The secrecy surrounding Queen Victoria's intimate cleanliness practices usually received maintenance by quiet, yet occasionally the actuality broke through. One of the most striking testimonies described the day when a physician fainted during an examination. This proved not an ordinary physician's visit. It represented an attempt to conduct a gynecological check, something already uncommon. Because of the Queen's hesitation, the physician received permission to commence, yet he failed to finish. Following the documentation, the smell and the oppressive surroundings of the chamber proved too substantial to tolerate. He staggered, became pale, and then departed abruptly, powerless to proceed. The incident shocked those present, yet the Queen's reaction failed to consider her practices. Rather, she became angry that a man would display weakness and render her circumstance obvious. Victoria's regulations about medical attention had remained strict always. She permitted examinations solely with her direct permission, and those permissions received provisions sparingly. Male physicians remained always at a disadvantage in such situations. The fainting of one of them validated her suspicions that they proved unfit for the assignment. From that day onward, she declined to permit men to participate in her gynecological attention. She declared that solely women, and solely under certain circumstances, might attend to her in this manner. It proved not a decision founded on wellness, but on satisfaction. It approaches comedy that rather than examining why a physician collapsed, the Queen regarded it as evidence that men proved weak, and that she directly proved right to proceed with her disregard. The physician directly never received public naming. His account endured in whispers and in the recollections of those who worked in the residence. The language applied to describe his reaction mentioned a heavy stench and surroundings that constricted the throat. Workers grasped precisely what this indicated, for they too had existed in those rooms. Yet for an outsider, regardless a professional physician, the actuality arrived as a shock. The mixture of unwashed flesh, stale materials and heavy window coverings produced surroundings that proved unbearable to someone not familiar with it. For a physician trained to tolerate disagreeableness, to collapse proved telling enough. The Queen's anger following the incident proved fierce. She accepted it as a personal insult that a man failed to finish his obligation in her presence. She failed to blame her individual practices, nor the smell that occupied the chamber. She blamed weakness. Her decision to exclude men from future examinations proved final. Following, her gynecological attention received conduct by female attendants under circumstances she tightly managed. These circumstances featured dim lighting and the application of gloves manufactured of soft material, therefore that examinations felt less invasive. Yet the genuine matter stayed the refusal to clean correctly rendered all attempts at medical attention more challenging. The incident turned into a caution to others. Physicians who worked for her in subsequent years understood the restrictions they would encounter. They modified their methods, reduced their visits, and laboured within her regulations. The emphasis turned not on complete attention, but on meeting the Queen's expectations. This indicated that numerous troubles received overlooking or received treatment superficially. Effectively, her command once more exceeded medical logic. If such an occurrence happened now, with a physician fainting from the smell of a patient, it would probably result in immediate intervention, serious questions and modifications in treatment. In the Victorian residence, though, the incident received burial under quiet and submission. The workers who witnessed it recalled it quietly. For them, it represented additional evidence of what they already tolerated. They understood that the Queen's refusal to wash produced surroundings challenging to bear. They had observed it, detected it, and transported it in the materials they cleaned. To observe a physician collapse solely validated what they had long understood. Yet none of them might speak openly. Quiet proved the regulation, and the incident vanished from public understanding. The Queen directly never changed. Rather than reconsidering her decisions, she intensified them. She considered the physician's collapse as an insult to her worth, instead of proof of her individual disregard. To her, the incident strengthened her sense of command. She stayed certain that modesty and self-control mattered more than health or keeping clean. The patterns that had caused the trouble weren't changed even slightly. Records indicate that following this episode, checkups became even more rare. When they did happen, the light was kept low. Candles or lanterns were dimmed to soften the mood. Gloves made of cloth, not leather or rubber, were used by attendants. These circumstances made examination ceremonial rather than useful. They comforted the Queen but did little for her well-being. The outcome was abandonment disguised as decent care. The image of the fainting physician was striking. It demonstrated how even those trained to withstand the worst couldn't ignore the reality of her patterns, yet the message wasn't understood the way one might assume. Rather than prompting change, it became another reason for her beliefs. She removed men from her personal care completely and carried on as she always had. The pattern of abandonment continued. I find it disturbing to picture being in that space, observing a doctor stumble, understanding exactly why it occurred, yet being held by silence while the Queen maintained she was correct. That scene captures the depth of refusal that encircled her. The fainting episode also shows the force of authority in defining truth. The reality of the Queen's state was obvious to those there, but the account never reached the broader public. Instead, it was converted into another fragment of palace mystery. The common view of Victoria stayed intact, her honour protected by silence. Behind the drapes, however, the facts were different. Her dependence on limited female care carried out under low light with fabric gloves wasn't advancement, but withdrawal. It permitted her to keep her sense of decency without confronting the discomfort of her own abandonment. But in the act, it denied her of the medical attention that could have enhanced her well-being. The fainting of the physician had been a signal, but it wasn't followed. The collapse of a doctor during her checkup proved what servants had long understood and exposed what the Queen wouldn't acknowledge. It demonstrated the results of abandonment in the most striking way imaginable. But rather than triggering reform, it brought only tighter rules and greater mystery. A physician fainted, the Queen became furious, and medical attention was limited even more. The palace adjusted to her wishes, but the troubles stayed. And if the collapse of a doctor seemed startling, the truth of her unwashed hair and the way she handled her bedding added yet another dimension to the hidden deterioration of her daily existence. The bed of Queen Victoria was not simply a place of sleep, but also a place where her patterns left traces that couldn't easily be erased. Among the most notable examples was the state of her pillows. She didn't dry her hair after the uncommon times when she washed it. Rather, she let it dry on its own, thinking that air drying was healthier and more appropriate. This meant that night after night she pressed her wet head onto pillows covered in fine fabric. The wetness sank into the filling, blending with natural oils from her scalp. With time, the cloth grew discoloured and the filling dense. The stench that followed clung to her pillows long after the wetness had dried. Victoria didn't view this as a trouble. She thought of it as normal. just another aspect of everyday existence. The notion of regularly changing or washing pillows didn't interest her. Once the covers were positioned, they often stayed for weeks, sometimes more. During that stretch, sweat, oil, and grime built up. What might have been a straightforward matter of cleanliness for another individual became for her a routine of abandonment. It's almost ridiculous to picture the queen of a massive empire placing her head each night on pillows drenched with oil and fungus, as if her crown made her resistant to the stench. Yet this was the reality of her personal existence. Servants faced the results. Each morning the stench of old oil and wet hair remained in the air around her bed. To hide it, they sprayed perfumed water or scattered fragrances around the borders of the pillows. These attempts never eliminated the smell. They only placed another scent over it, forming a blend of mustiness and flowers that clung to the bedroom. Servants were required to perform these duties quietly, never hinting that the trouble came from the queen's refusal to alter her patterns. The cloth of the pillows grew darker with time. Discoloration spread outward from where her head lay. The filling inside, made of feathers or wool, soaked up oil until it became dense and bunched together. No amount of shaking could bring back its original plushness. The stench was so lasting that servants sometimes retched when moving the pillows. Yet nobody dared speak a word. The Queen's standards about cleanliness, or rather her absence of them, were handled as absolute. If such a routine existed now, it would be like refusing to change a pillowcase for months, and letting hair oil sink deep into the filling, then hiding the stench with perfume sprays. No home would find that tolerable. Yet it stayed normal in her palace. The smell from the pillows mixed with other stenches in the bedroom. Drapes, pulled tightly around the bed, contained the air inside. Sweat from her body, smells from her bedding, and oils from her hair all merged to form an environment that was dense and choking. Servants entering in the morning described privately the sensation of having something grab in their throats as soon as they walked inside. The pillows nearest to her head added the most. Every night they soaked up more, and every morning they gave it back into the air. The absence of cleanliness wasn't without results. Oils on the scalp, blended with wetness from hair that hadn't been dried, formed perfect circumstances for irritation. Flakes and itching were frequent, but they were handled as normal burdens. Victoria saw no cause to alter her method. To her, it was preferable to let nature follow its path than to bother with cloths, combs, or drying techniques. This conviction, stated often in her routines, strengthened abandonment as self-control. I find it deeply troubling to picture being the servant in charge of lifting those pillows, breathing the smell of months-old sweat and oil, while understanding that I could never propose replacing them. It demonstrates how authority influenced even the tiniest details of existence in the palace. The image of the pillows went deeper. They symbolized the split between common and personal appearance. In common, Victoria seemed as the representation of structure, morality, and royal honour. In personal, she laid her head on pillows that smelled of unwashed hair and old oil. This split never reached her subjects, but it was experienced daily by those who worked nearest to her. The quiet of servants maintained the appearance while they bore the facts. The pillows also showed how small abandonments could become lasting troubles. Once oil soaked into the filling, there was no simple way to extract it. Washing wasn't viewed as a choice. Replacing the pillows would have demanded recognizing the problem. Rather, they were left in position, becoming part of the surroundings. The stench that clung to them became the stench of her quarters, an inescapable reminder of abandonment hidden beneath the surface of magnificence. Victoria's demand on what she labelled naturalness was, in action, a refusal of cleanliness. She thought that air-drying her hair and leaving her pillows unchanged demonstrated self-control. In reality, it spread smell and discomfort to everyone surrounding her. The servants who hid the stench each morning understood the facts, but their quiet was required. They folded the linens, sprayed the perfumes, and kept the Queen's mysteries. The state of the Queen's pillows mirrored her wider approach to cleanliness. It wasn't restricted to hair or bedding. It was part of a sequence that included her refusal to bathe, her unwashed clothing, and her dependence on cloths instead of actual washing. Each pattern strengthened the others, forming an environment that was both crushing and unhealthy. Victoria's pillows, drenched with oil and wet from unwashed hair, brought the smell of abandonment into every night. And every morning servants attempted to hide it with sprays and perfumes. But the facts couldn't be concealed from those who lived within the palace boundaries. For the Queen, it was normal. For those surrounding her, it was another weight borne in quiet. Her pillows grew dense with oil, her quarters filled with fragrance, and her servants worked each morning to hide what couldn't be removed. The Queen carried on as always, certain that her way was appropriate. But the smell of her pillows was only one element of the dense air in her spaces. For even the boundaries and drapes themselves started to soak up the stenches of her patterns. The air inside Queen Victoria's personal quarters was influenced not only by her patterns of personal abandonment, but also by the way her spaces were organised. The drapes were always pulled, the windows seldom opened, and the space was loaded with dense fabrics that soaked up whatever smells were released into the air. This meant that every method of hers, particularly her use of the chamber pot, left its trace not only on the bedding and ground, but also on the very boundaries and drapes surrounding her. Servants who entered described the stench as choking, a blend of stale air and ammonia that grabbed at the throat. One even noted in personal that the boundaries seemed to inhale along with her, taking in and releasing the smell of waste. It wasn't an overstatement. The thick fabrics of the space held everything, making the stench a lasting feature. Victoria refused to permit her windows to be opened without her command. She thought that currents of fresh air brought sickness and that sealing the space protected her well-being. This conviction, widespread among some Victorians, had the reverse result. The absence of airflow meant that ammonia vapours from her chamber pot accumulated overnight and stayed during the day. By morning, when servants came to tidy and the air was thick with smell, yet they couldn't take the straightforward step of opening a window, that decision belonged to her alone. It's almost ridiculous that in a palace loaded with riches and authority, the Queen's dread of a breeze left her quarters smelling like a sealed barn. The fabrics in the space played a significant part. Drapes made of velvet or dense brocade encircled her bed and covered her windows. Padded chairs, cushions and rugs loaded the space. Each of these materials soaked up smells and retained them. Ammonia from waste, merged with the stenches of sweat and unwashed bedding, sank deep into the cloth. Even when the surface looked clean, the smell remained. Servants dusted and sprayed perfumes, but they never addressed the deeper trouble. The result grew more powerful with time. With each passing day, more vapours were soaked into the boundaries and fabrics. The stench became less like something brief and more like part of the framework itself. Servants observed that even after complete cleaning of the chamber pot and removal of bedding, the air of the space still brought the smell. It clung to the drapes. Most of all, these were pulled tightly around her bed at night, containing the vapours inside. By morning, when the drapes were opened, the discharge of air brought a powerful wave of ammonia into the space. If such a method existed now, it would be like someone sealing every window, refusing all airflow and permitting bathroom smells to sink into their boundaries until the house itself smelled lastingly unclean. Nobody would accept such a state in modern existence. Yet in the palace, it was tolerated. The servants in charge of her quarters bore the greatest weight. They entered each morning to take away the chamber pot, wipe the furniture and spray perfumed water around the space. But they understood these were only surface actions. The stench was in the boundaries, the drapes and the rugs. They described privately how the smell seemed to track them out of the quarter, grabbing to their clothing and hair long after they departed. It was a daily reminder of their obligation, an obligation that required quiet. I find it deeply troubling to picture being one of those attendants commanded to tidy a space so filled with waste vapours that even the boundaries seemed living with stench. Yet being prevented from taking the straightforward step of opening a window, the quiet must have felt as dense as the air itself. Victoria herself didn't recognise the smell. To her, the sealed space was a barrier, not a cell. She viewed the dense drapes as defence from sickness and the sealed windows as evidence of authority. She appreciated the look of structure even as the reality was one of choking air. Her power guaranteed that nobody questioned this perspective. Servants could cough, retch, or turn ashen, but they couldn't object. The Queen's ease mattered more than their pain. The continuation of the smell mirrored the wider splits of her rule. She commanded over an empire that professed advancement and refinement, yet her personal existence was characterized by states most poor homes would have attempted to prevent. The palace, furnished with riches, brought the stench of abandonment. This wasn't a consequence of need, but of conviction. Her refusal to accept airflow and washing meant that the trouble stayed by decision, not requirement. The state of her quarters also brought dangers beyond discomfort. Extended contact with ammonia vapours can irritate the eyes, lungs and throat. Servants probably endured from these results, though they had no authority to require change. The Queen herself, inhaling the same air nightly, may also have felt irritation, but she understood it as normal rather than as something avoidable. The patterns of abandonment were reshaped in her mind as self-control, as they were in so many aspects of her existence. The drapes and boundaries became silent observers to her routines. They soaked up every smell and discharged it slowly day after day. They were never completely tidied, never replaced for the purpose of freshness. Their beauty stayed on the surface, but beneath it lay years of gathered waste. The split was harsh. Velvet decorated with gold thread smelled of urine, and boundaries covered in fine cloth brought the fragrance of abandonment. Victoria's refusal to permit airflow or recognise the smell converted her quarters into a place where servants worked each day against a trouble they couldn't resolve. Perfumes, incense and perfumed water hid it briefly, but the stench always came back. It was part of the space, part of her existence, part of the quiet that encircled her patterns. Her boundaries and drapes, filled with ammonia vapours, stood as reminders of abandonment, concealed beneath magnificence. The air of her quarters was dense, the fabrics unclean, and the servants helpless. Yet even as this trouble expanded, another aspect of her spaces brought an equally disturbing truth. For the very rugs beneath her feet were never washed, only beaten. And they too became holders of smell that could never be extracted. The grounds of Queen Victoria's personal quarters were covered with thick rugs, selected for their beauty and their capacity to insulate the space. These rugs were woven with rich designs, dense threads and deep piles that expressed riches and position. But beneath the look of magnificence was another reality. The thickness of the cloth soaked up every smell in the space and retained it for years. The chamber pot under her bed discharged ammonia vapours. The drapes contained stale air, and her unwashed bedding brought sweat and oil. All of this sank into the rugs, particularly in the area beneath and surrounding her bed. With no arrangement of regular washing, the rugs became lasting storage for the stenches of her personal existence. Tidying the rugs was a restricted act. Servants were permitted to beat the rugs with paddles or rods to discharge visible grime. They brought them outside on uncommon times or beat them in position, lifting clouds of dirt that dropped back onto the furniture. But they were never allowed to use water. Victoria thought that wetting the rugs would harm them and bring sickness into the space. As a consequence, the smells inside the cloth were never addressed. They stayed concealed beneath the surface, expanding more powerful with every passing year. It's almost ridiculous that in a palace full of luxury, the most commanding woman of her time walked each day onto rugs that smelled of waste and sweat, yet labelled it honour. Servants described how the rugs beneath the bed brought the greatest stench. This was where the chamber pot sat at night, exposed and discharging vapours. The air was thickest here, and the strands of the rug soaked it up most directly. When servants knelt to tidy near the bed, they sometimes retched from the smell, yet they had no option but to persist. Their commands were to keep the rugs dry, no matter how powerful the stench became. Perfumes were used heavily in an effort to hide the trouble. Bottles of perfumed water were sprayed across the space each morning. Sometimes rugs were dusted with dried herbs or powders to refresh them briefly. These actions never worked for long. The smell came back within hours, rising from the strands with every step. Servants learned to exist with the stench as part of their obligations, even though it grabbed to their clothes and hair. Long after they departed the quarters, the rugs grew darker with use. Grime, sweat, oils and perfumes all mixed together into a surface that was far from clean. But because they were never washed, they were handled as lasting features of the space. Even when sections were thin, the stench stayed. Visitors who were allowed to the quarters seldom grasped what they were inhaling. They observed dense air, but they didn't recognize the origin. Only those who worked near to the Queen understood how deep the trouble went. If the same thing occurred now, it would be like covering a bedroom ground with thick rugs, never washing them, only spraying perfume over them and assuming the stench of waste to vanish. No modern home would tolerate such abandonment, but inside the palace it was unquestioned. The well-being results of these rugs were not minor. Grime caught within them irritated lungs and throats. Ammonia vapours blended with strands and discharged slowly, forming constant contact. Servants often coughed or acquired sore throats after tidying. The Queen herself inhaled the same air each night, but she rejected discomfort as normal. She chose to think that her sealed spaces were defending her rather than harming her. For the servants, the rugs were among the most unpleasant obligations. They had to kneel on them, beat them, and inhale the grime and smell. They wrote privately of the challenge, but they never spoke openly. To challenge the Queen's commands about tidying techniques would have been viewed as disrespectful. The standard was plain: no water, no soaking, only dry beating and perfumes. The stench, no matter how powerful, wasn't to be stated. I find it disturbing to picture working in such states, kneeling on a rug that reeked of ammonia and sweat, required to beat it daily while acting it was as fine as the day it was made. That quiet demonstrates the force of power more than any command could. The rugs also symbolised the wider splits of the Queen's existence. They were objects of riches and beauty, shown as symbols of royal preference. Yet they smelled of abandonment concealed beneath their designs. Guests praised their patterns, unaware of what they held. Servants bore their reality, unable to expose the facts. The separation between look and reality was stitched into every thread. The trouble only expanded with time. After 5 years, the smell in the rugs had become lasting. No amount of perfume, dusting or beating could extract it. The strands themselves brought the stench, discharging it slowly into the air. The palace was furnished to impress the eye, but the nose revealed another account. The facts were concealed, just as so many aspects of the Queen's personal existence were concealed. The refusal to permit actual tidying again mirrored her convictions. She thought water brought sickness, and so she prohibited it. She trusted perfumes to hide smells rather than recognising that perfumes only added another dimension. Her servants were caught in her standards, unable to do what they understood was required. The rugs stayed as monuments to abandonment walked upon daily, but never truly clean. Victoria's rugs, particularly those near her bed, soaked up years of sweat, ammonia and grime, without ever being washed. Servants beat them, sprayed them and bore their smell, but they never viewed them fresh. To the Queen, they were fine furnishings. To those who existed with them, they were holders of stenches that wouldn't die. The rugs, unwashed and dense with years of smell, stayed beneath her feet, part of the quiet of the palace. Servants followed her commands, hid what they could, and tolerated the rest. But if the rug expressed hidden abandonment, her mouth exposed another account. For even her breath brought a smell that unsettled those nearest to her. Queen Victoria's attitude toward her mouth and teeth was as firm as her standards about the rest of her cleanliness. She refused to permit her teeth to be checked openly and was infamous for keeping her mouth sealed during medical visits. Nobody outside her nearest circle ever viewed her full set of teeth. She found it improper for men, even physicians, to look directly into her mouth. When dental attention was absolutely required, she positioned severe restrictions on how it was to be performed. Dentists were permitted to touch only under firm standards. They had to cover their noses to prevent the stench and were prohibited from making remarks of any sort about what they viewed or smelled. The Queen's honour, in her perspective, mattered more than facts or well-being. The state of her teeth mirrored years of abandonment. She never brushed them with an actual brush. Rather, she wiped them occasionally with a cloth dipped in powerful alcohol. This extracted little and left food caught between her teeth. With time, rot set in, holes spread, and her gums grew swollen. The stench that came from her mouth was clear. Servants who attended her described her breath as sour and metallic, bringing traces of wine, food, and rot. Dentists who worked with her struggled to continue their checks without pulling back. It's almost ridiculous that a queen who directed armies and commanded over continents couldn't permit a dentist to clean her teeth without first requiring that he cover his nose. The stench of her breath was more than unpleasant. It made checks challenging to the point of being nearly impossible. Dentists were demanded to bear it quietly, holding cloths or perfumed handkerchiefs near their faces as they worked. One record even hinted that a dentist once turned his head away mid-check, unable to face her directly because of the smell. Yet these humiliations didn't prompt her to alter her patterns. She thought that regular cleaning would weaken her teeth and cause them to drop out. In her perspective, leaving them alone was a form of defense. The mystery around her mouth was firm. She often expressed with her lips held tightly, and she prevented smiling widely in common. Images of her seldom display her teeth, a detail that mirrors her personal discomfort. Inside the palace, this mystery was even more firm. Physicians were commanded not to write openly about her dental state, and attendants were instructed never to remark. Even her family members seldom viewed her teeth plainly. It was a part of her body she wanted concealed from view. The contradiction of this mystery was that the stench of her breath made concealing impossible. Anyone near to her understood immediately that her mouth was in poor state. Servants standing near her bed in the morning, physicians leaning near during checks, even attendants securing her gowns could smell it. No amount of fragrance could hide it. The stench was powerful, relentless, and profoundly disturbing. If a similar situation occurred now, it would be like a public figure rejecting all oral hygiene while demanding complete discretion. Though their foul breath turned every interaction into an ordeal, nobody in today's world would accept it from someone in authority. Still, within the royal residence, quiet complicity kept reality concealed. Even dental practitioners left careful written accounts of their encounters. They documented the monarch's unwillingness to open her jaw properly, her fury when pressed to assist, and the suffocating stench that rendered their work unbearable. One record even captured her declaration that teeth weren't intended for male observation, as if her sense of propriety trumped her well-being. Staff recalled how dental professionals would emerge looking drained and trembling after appointments, some even gagging from the odour they'd been exposed to. Yet none of this information leaked beyond the walls. Her reputation stayed pristine despite the reality of her oral condition. The state of her dental health deteriorated progressively. Left without treatment, decay expanded, gum tissue withdrew, and staining became increasingly apparent. She suffered through dental pain that could persist for days on end, yet she wouldn't allow extractions or restorations. She insisted that foreign materials introduced into the mouth would upset her system's inherent equilibrium. This conviction left her with fractured and rotting teeth that remained permanently damaged. The discomfort never ceased, but she accepted it as part of what she viewed as self-discipline. For those who served her, her breath represented yet another hardship. They couldn't escape it while assisting with her wardrobe positioned next to her seat, or caring for her during rest. The stench permeated the space, blending with other scents already lingering there. They tolerated it without protest, just as they tolerated everything else. I find it disturbing to picture being in that proximity, compelled to endure the sharp metallic breath of royalty while acting as though everything was normal. The image embodies both the force of her power and the price of remaining silent. The monarch's unwillingness to maintain her oral hygiene aligned with her overall attitude toward personal care. She dismissed contemporary methods, held on to notions that protected her ego, and disregarded the results. Her self-respect, from her perspective, mattered more than her physical condition. The concealment surrounding her mouth became representative of the concealment surrounding her whole existence. On the surface, she displayed control and authority. Beneath it, she lived with deterioration. Her dental practitioners, restricted by protocol and overcome by smell, could accomplish little beyond making brief appearances. Shortly withdrawing in defeat, staff carried on with their responsibilities, enduring the smell without complaint. The monarch kept insisting everything was fine. The pattern of abandonment continued, exactly as it had throughout every other aspect of her existence. Her concealed teeth, her overwhelming breath, and her rejection of treatment exposed the tensions between outward appearance and inner reality. She kept her jaw shut, yet the smell gave her away. She required silence, yet her breath communicated more than language ever could. Her unwillingness to expose her teeth and her insistence that practitioners work quietly left her with damaged, decayed, and aching gums. The odour of her breath saturated her quarters, causing even trained professionals to recoil. Yet if her mouth demonstrated neglect, the condition of her teeth revealed an even grimmer picture. Because they remained discoloured, fractured, and ignored, bearing years of decay without intervention. The condition of Queen Victoria's teeth grew increasingly severe as time went on. Still, she refused to adopt any of the steps that might have arrested their decline. Decay consumed her back teeth. Fractures appeared across the surface and fragments of teeth broke off. Rather than pursuing fillings or fixes, she maintained that leaving the destruction untouched was preferable for her constitution. She worried that placing metal inside her mouth would disturb her body's intrinsic harmony. Some records even indicate she thought metals would sap her strength, diminishing her vigour. For this reason, broken teeth stayed ragged, darkened and throbbing, yet never addressed with the instruments practitioners had on hand. This resistance meant that her teeth became noticeably stained. They transformed from light yellow to tan, and eventually to black. Around the perimeters, cavities expanded until they were obvious when she parted her lips to talk. Still, she continued opposing contemporary procedures. Restorations, which were growing more widespread during that era, were rejected completely by her. They were artificial. Practitioners were told not to propose them, and if they attempted to, they were cut off immediately. The monarch chose to endure privately rather than embrace what she perceived as invasive techniques. It seems almost ridiculous to picture the ruler of the British Empire turning down dental restorations because she believed a small bit of metal would drain her vitality. Rather than mint solutions which could have addressed odour, she rejected those as well. She found the intense cooling sensation of peppermint or spearmint unpleasant, insisting it was artificial and too aggressive. Mint rinses, starting to emerge in Britain throughout her rule, never came near her mouth. As an alternative, she occasionally rinsed with concentrated alcohol or with black tea. Neither approach provided genuine protection. Alcohol stung but didn't cleanse properly, while tea deposited tannins that merely darkened her teeth more. Across time, her dependence on these alternatives aggravated her situation instead of alleviating it. Practitioners who saw her encountered limitations at every turn. They couldn't restore, they couldn't clean thoroughly, and they couldn't propose alternatives. She rejected their input. Their function became symbolic instead of therapeutic. They examined quickly, touched gently, and left as rapidly as they could. Any hint of more aggressive intervention risked provoking her. In reality, her oral care amounted to no care whatsoever. Cavities expanded, fractures multiplied, and staining intensified. Her gum tissue became swollen and frequently bled during meals. The monarch's refusal to permit proper dental treatment didn't just impact her well-being, but it also impacted everyone near her. Her breath, already offensive from insufficient brushing, deteriorated further as her teeth decayed more. Staff in her presence spoke of a smell of decomposition combined with alcohol and tea. Practitioners found themselves obligated to shield their faces during quick evaluations, a practice she actually permitted, provided they never remarked on it. The stench became inseparable from her presence, impossible to avoid for anyone who approached her. If these practices existed now, it would resemble someone declining all dental intervention, shunning toothpaste, washing only with liquor, and then questioning why their teeth were black and falling apart. The ridiculousness highlights how drastically her behaviours diverged from common sense. The impact on her looks was another consideration. Images of the monarch seldom reveal her teeth, and this was intentional. She avoided grinning openly and prevented showing her mouth before others. The discretion surrounding her dental condition was part of her wider discretion about cleanliness. Staff witnessed the facts every day, yet the public remained unaware. The difference between her reputation as a powerful, respectable leader and the truth of her failing teeth stayed carefully protected. Only through personal writings and subsequent reports did the reality surface. The agony of her situation must have been unrelenting. Rotted teeth typically cause infections and nerve damage, yet Victoria carried them as marks of fortitude. She took pride in tolerance, thinking that suffering demonstrated her resolve. Rather than finding relief, she reinterpreted the pain as a virtuous challenge. This perspective mirrored her broader understanding of cleanliness too. Discomfort wasn't something to be avoided, but something to be accepted as evidence of restraint. I find it troubling to envision her enduring lengthy government sessions, her mouth throbbing with neglected decay, her breath contaminating the atmosphere, yet her vanity preventing her from accepting even the most basic care. It paints a picture of discipline that masked abandonment. For her staff and attendants, the condition of her teeth generated another everyday challenge. They remained close during dining, smelling the stench of decomposing food lodged in damaged teeth. They assisted her with evening preparations, detecting the same stench as she communicated. Practitioners suffered through appointments that accomplished nothing, coming back repeatedly to confront identical circumstances. The quiet demanded of them weighed as heavily as the reek itself. The monarch's dismissal of restorations and adequate rinses mirrored her wider dismissal of advancement. The 19th century witnessed developments in hygiene, healthcare, and community wellness. Yet Britain's ruler rejected these developments. In her personal sphere, she adhered to her own convictions even when they resulted in suffering and distress. Her position enabled her to do this without opposition. What would have drawn criticism from others was tolerated in her because of her station. Her teeth, left neglected, represented more than simple abandonment. They represented the paradoxes of her leadership. A leader who governed an empire that championed innovation existed personally in deterioration. A figure who embodied structure and virtue concealed teeth that were shattered, black and rotten. The privacy protecting them safeguarded her reputation, yet it didn't alter the facts. Her refusal to fill cavities, her aversion to mint, and her use of tea and alcohol left her with teeth that disintegrated gradually across time. Staff tolerated the smell, practitioners tolerated the constraints, and the monarch tolerated the suffering. To her, it represented strength. To everyone else, it represented silence. Her teeth, shattered and blackened, became another sign of her abandonment. They illustrated her arrogance, her resistance to progress, and her preference for discipline above ease. Yet, if her mouth was a wellspring of odour and secrecy, the actual bed she rested in disclosed another issue equally concerning. Because the linens and mattresses supporting her frame were left unwashed. For years, the bed of Queen Victoria served as a focal point of her routine, a location where she passed extended periods drafting correspondence, welcoming guests, and sleeping behind thick drapes. Yet while the appearance of the bed seemed majestic, the reality underneath it conveyed a contrasting narrative. The heavy mattress was never appropriately cleaned. Rather, only the linens and covers on the surface were replaced, and even those were switched at extended gaps. The mattress itself soaked up perspiration, oils, and smell from her frame. Each evening across the years, it became drenched with what could never be extracted. Staff who transported or raised the mattress documented privately about the smell, characterizing it as crushing, almost intoxicating in its density. Victoria thought that regular washing of bedding was pointless. She found it disruptive and believed that mattresses, being too massive and awkward to shift, didn't need consideration. Rather, her staff were directed to replace only the upper layers, like the linens or the blanket covers. The mattress stayed untouched year upon year. With each evening's rest, more perspiration and smell penetrated its filling. It became weightier, darker, and more rancid with time. It's almost absurd that a monarch who ruled the mightiest empire of her period selected to rest on a mattress that reeked worse than the beds of the most destitute slums. The density of the mattress intensified the issue. It was packed with feathers and horsehair, substances that soaked up moisture readily. Each evening, her body warmth forced perspiration deep into the padding. Once within, it never evaporated entirely. The outcome was a lasting dampness that turned sour across time. Fragrance mists and powders were applied each morning to disguise the smell, yet these merely contributed another dimension of scent. The core issue was never resolved. Staff dreaded the occasions when the bedding needed to be removed. Pulling away the linens exposed stains that had seeped into the mattress itself. When the mattress was shifted, the smell discharged into the space was so intense that one attendant later documented he believed he would pass out. Another characterized the smell as the exhalation of the chamber, as if the mattress itself breathed years of neglect. Still, these encounters were never discussed publicly. To question the monarch's practices was inconceivable. Quiet was integral to their obligation. The monarch's refusal to have her mattress cleaned reflected her larger convictions about cleanliness. She mistrusted water, resented disruption, and found discipline in tolerance. To her, a mattress was furnishing, not an element of hygiene. Replacing linens sufficed. The internal layers didn't count. This conviction overlooked the truth of what her frame deposited each evening. If someone now slept for years on identical unwashed bedding, replacing only the sheets while allowing perspiration to penetrate deeper and deeper, the stench would force them from their own quarters. For Victoria, it became routine existence. The smell of the mattress filled her rooms. Drapes pulled firmly around the bed contained the smell within. Each morning when the drapes were drawn back, the atmosphere released was thick with ammonia, perspiration, and fragrance. Staff attempted to freshen the space with incense, yet it never endured. The mattress remained the origin, immovable and untouched. Across time, the smell became so constant that staff observed it attached to their garments. After labouring in the chamber, health hazards were inevitable. A mattress saturated with perspiration and dampness created a breeding environment for bacteria and pests. It triggered skin inflammation and led to breathing difficulties. Staff who managed it described coughing, sneezing, and inflamed throats. The monarch herself probably felt irritation, yet she dismissed it as ordinary. Her conviction that discipline meant resisting ease prevented her from seeing the results of neglect. I find it disturbing to picture resting each evening on bedding so saturated with perspiration and smell that staff characterized it as intoxicating, yet still thinking it was respectable. The tension between extravagance and truth couldn't have been starker. The privacy surrounding the mattress paralleled the privacy surrounding her other practices. Outsiders never observed it, never detected it, and never learned of it. Paintings and accounts of her rooms spoke of refinement, not smell. The reality stayed concealed inside the royal structure, endured solely by those who attended her immediately. Again, the divide between outward reputation and personal truth was enormous. The mattress also illustrated how minor neglects built into something lasting. What started as a basic decision not to clean developed across decades into furnishing that retained the smell of her complete rule. No quantity of fragrance could eliminate it. No linen could entirely mask it. The mattress became a quiet testament to her practices, an item that retained years of perspiration and deterioration. The staff paid the highest price. They were the individuals who raised the mattress, removed the linens, and endured the smell. They were also the individuals who understood the reality most accurately, yet their accounts were never voiced. The monarch's position quieted them. Their obligation required tolerance, exactly as her convictions required neglect. The monarch's mattress, heavy with perspiration and rancid with age, disclosed the truth of her cleanliness in a manner that no language could. It was the concealed centre of her rooms, a personal item that held communal significance. It demonstrated how fortune and influence could mask neglect, yet never remove it. The mattress communicated the truth, even when nobody else was able. Her mattress, left unwashed and unchanged, became a testament to abandonment, concealed underneath a semblance of magnificence. Staff endured its smell. The monarch dismissed its dangers, and the residence itself absorbed its stench. Yet if her mattress bore the weight of her neglect during evening hours, the clothing she donned at night bore another reality. Because even her nightgowns were never laundered as they ought to have been. The nightgowns of Queen Victoria weren't typical clothing. They were constructed from thick silk and expensive materials selected to convey status. Yet they rapidly became part of her extensive catalogue of unsanitary practices. Each evening she donned them for hours in chambers sealed from outdoor air. The gowns soaked up her frame's perspiration, the oils from her skin and the heavy fragrances applied liberally on her before sleep. In the morning, instead of being laundered, they were gently removed by staff and draped over a seat near an opening. The sunlight or breeze was supposed to refresh them, yet washing was uncommon. For Victoria, airing the clothing sufficed. Across the years, these nightgowns became rigid with build-up and marked with discoloration. They retained the smell of her frame and the thick blend of fragrance layered on top. The reasoning behind this method aligned with her broader suspicion of cleaning. She believed repeated laundering would harm the silk and viewed soap and water as needless. From her viewpoint, the material only needed to be maintained, not scrubbed. The outcome was a collection of clothing that became offensive with usage, yet stayed in circulation. It's almost absurd that the monarch of the British Empire slept in garments that reeked worse each passing week, while her subjects were supposed to respect her as an emblem of respectability. This tension revealed how surfaces mattered more than substance in her residence. Staff characterised the state of these gowns in confidential records. After merely a handful of days of wearing, the silk darkened at the underarms and torso where perspiration was most concentrated. The material lost its smoothness, becoming rigid where fragrance and oil combined. By week's end, the smell was powerful enough that staff hesitated to touch the clothing. Still, they were prohibited from laundering them without receiving direct permission. Rather, they were folded, suspended, or refolded, with the smell remaining in the atmosphere surrounding them. The gowns became what some labelled a chronicle of stenches. Each section of material revealed the account of evenings passed in sealed chambers. Oils created stains in certain areas, fragrance adhered to others, and perspiration marks formed lasting blemishes. The clothing stopped being smooth emblems of monarchy and rather became thick, rigid monuments to abandonment. For the staff assigned to managing them, this was degrading labour. They needed to suspend breathing while folding silk intended for royalty. Across time, the gathering of these garments generated storage difficulties. Closets contained not merely new silk gowns, but also collections of aged ones that had never been laundered. The smell of musty material expanded into cabinets and chests. For the residence workers, this became yet another responsibility that brought distress. They sprayed fragrances into the closets, yet this merely generated stronger mixtures of smell. The smell was never eliminated, merely masked. If contrasted with contemporary practices, it would resemble someone now donning identical sleepwear every evening for months, perspiring into them continuously, then suspending them on a seat to reuse without ever laundering. The notion is unsettling. Still, this was the procedure in the royal residence. While civilization outside was starting to accept the concept of hygiene and cleanliness, the monarch's own selections moved in the contrary direction. The medical results were also genuine. Donning unwashed garments against the body elevates the likelihood of rashes, infections, and inflammation. Victoria allegedly experienced recurring skin issues, particularly on her torso and underarms. Staff documented that she frequently protested of itching, though she didn't associate it with her garments. Physicians who examined her seldom ventured to indicate that cleanliness was the source. Quiet surrounding the monarch's practices was maintained rigidly. I find it profoundly unsettling to envision these nightgowns stiffening with deposits of perspiration and fragrance, becoming a constant source of inflammation, yet still being worn proudly by the ruler. The notion of staff folding and refolding such clothing, never permitted to clean them, contributes another dimension of distress to the account. The meaning of the gowns was unmistakable. On the exterior they appeared refined, displaying fortune and standing. Upon inspection, they revealed a contrasting account. They exposed the abandonment concealed under the veneer of monarchy. They retained stenches that no volume of fragrance could conceal. The palace staff hated handling them, yet the Queen refused to alter her ways. For those maintaining the palace, the issue went far beyond her personal comfort. These clothes added to the overall stench of her private rooms. Draped over furniture or tucked into closets, they dispersed odours throughout the space. Mixed with the unwashed linens and drawn drapes, they produced an atmosphere that was stifling. Workers entering her bedroom each day felt assaulted by the smell. Some recorded later that the stench stayed in their hair long after they departed. These nightgowns represented a broader pattern. Instead of eliminating filth or stench, the Queen merely added more fragrances or oils over everything. The outcome wasn't cleanliness, but overpowering intensity. Her rooms didn't smell refined, but rather like a potent blend of decay and blossoms. The more she rejected washing, the more severe the situation grew. The staff understood this, but they were required to stay silent. Years of build-up had left their impression, Ancient gowns hardened with oil and perspiration were hidden away instead of thrown out. They became monuments to her practices, kept not deliberately, but through indifference. Even following her passing, certain garments held remnants of smell, reminding handlers of the reality beneath her existence. The tale of her nightgowns isn't merely about garments. It's about rejecting the most basic hygiene standards. It's about authority, forcing silence around practices that damaged not just the Queen, but everyone compelled to exist in her space. It's about how appearances concealed facts, and how those facts ultimately surfaced in more destructive forms. The Queen's nightgowns, used night after night unwashed, mirrored her rule in miniature. They looked refined from the outside, but were rotten in substance. They were maintained for respectability, but they brought discomfort and stench. They represented how authority can dismiss reality but cannot avoid it. Ultimately, these garments held more than fabric. They held the reality of her practices, her carelessness and her unwillingness to adapt. They left behind stenches that no fragrance could eliminate. They reminded her workers daily of what silence compelled them to bear. Queen Victoria's nightgowns, rigid with accumulated sweat, oil and perfume, reveal more than any official document. They demonstrate how her decisions affected her body, her workers and her residents. They expose how the Queen herself existed in circumstances she considered normal, but which others found intolerable. The tale of these garments is another fragment of proof that her hygiene defined her legacy. They stayed in her rooms, in her closets, and even in collections, bearing faint marks of what they once soaked up. They remind us that history isn't only about legislation and conflicts, but also about the concealed aspects of everyday existence. Queen Victoria's nightgowns became evidence of her carelessness, keeping the smells and marks of years of resistance to change. They saturated her rooms with stench, weighed down her workers, and represented her dismissal of contemporary cleanliness. And when her body ultimately failed, those practices showed themselves in the most disturbing manner, leaving even death unable to avoid the consequence of her decisions. When Queen Victoria's existence concluded, the practices she'd maintained for decades left a lasting impression that nobody could hide. The years of perspiration-drenched nightgowns, unwashed linens and closed rooms had permitted bacteria to multiply near her body. These weren't temporary circumstances, they were build-ups that influenced her health while alive and became apparent once she passed. Within less than 48 hours after her last breath, her body displayed decomposition signs at a rate that stunned the physicians assigned to handle her remains. The embalming procedure, typically successful for preserving royal bodies, couldn't match what her tissues had absorbed throughout her lifetime. Reports described the stench as overpowering. Medical professionals had anticipated the standard solemn responsibilities, but they encountered a smell that rose rapidly and permeated the room. The closed drapes and dense fabrics of her space trapped the gases her body expelled. For men who'd managed other royal bodies, the contrast was remarkable. The Queen's body, unlike her predecessors, didn't submit easily to preservation. The task of concealing her decline became a battle against time. It's grimly paradoxical that a woman who rejected washing from fear of vulnerability created a corpse that weakened the very men responsible for protecting her reputation. The decomposition rate was understood as the result of prolonged carelessness. Her skin had been blanketed for years in accumulated oil, perspiration and cloth that enabled bacteria to flourish. The very habits she thought preserved her vitality became the basis for her swift breakdown after death. Within hours, the smell penetrated the hallways. Servants murmured that they couldn't stay in the room without masking their faces. The physicians, prepared to handle challenging situations, confessed they were overwhelmed. The choice to conduct the funeral rapidly wasn't merely about timing or tradition, it was about hiding the truth. Officials understood that reports of a decaying body would bring shame to the crown. The public perception of Victoria had to stay one of order and magnificence. To acknowledge that her body failed her so quickly after death would invite mockery. The answer was speed. Her casket was closed, the ceremonies organised immediately, and her remains positioned beyond the reach of inquisitive observers. Behind closed doors, workers handled the heaviest burden. They readied her clothing, organised the space, and tried to cover smells with fragrances and blossoms. These attempts accomplished little. Perfume contributed sweetness, but the thick smell of decay pierced the air, became heavy, weighing on the lungs of everyone who entered. Even her immediate relatives restricted their time beside the casket. They showed up for obligation, lowered their heads, and departed as swiftly as circumstances allowed. If we picture such a scenario now, it would resemble attempting to hold a state funeral in a space where industrial contamination had been released, compelling mourners to stand rigid while battling nausea. The distance between respectability and truth couldn't have been greater. Medical professionals recorded observations in their notebooks. They attributed her lifelong poor hygiene to the speed of the decay. They spoke quietly of gases built up by years of enclosed fabric and tissues weakened by constant contact with filth. Though these records weren't intended for public consumption, they spread privately, influencing how insiders recalled her final moments. To them, her rapid breakdown wasn't mysterious. It was the inevitable result of decades of carelessness. For the monarchy, this was a threatening reality. Royalty had always been cloaked in ritual to conceal bodily frailty. Death was meant to display majesty, maintained beyond the grave. Victoria's death revealed the reverse. Her corpse deteriorated with alarming speed, exposing the reality she'd maintained behind curtains throughout life. The reality that officials hastened her burial testifies to their terror of controversy. I can't help but consider the distinction between the memorials erected to celebrate her and the putrid air that saturated her room as she lay deceased. The empire desired permanence, but her body offered them only haste. The quietness surrounding her practices during life transformed into quietness about her death. Nobody dared to discuss openly the stench, but those who witnessed it never dismissed it from memory. This occurrence completed the pattern of her life. While alive, she avoided water and grasped fabrics that captured sweat and fragrance. After death, those identical decisions exposed her, permitting bacteria to declare themselves before her memory could be crafted by ritual. The concluding act of her reign wasn't declarations or processions, but the smell of rot that compelled everyone to rush. For those nearest to her, the encounter was disturbing. Workers who had tolerated her rooms for years now confronted the most concentrated version of what they'd always experienced. The stench of the Queen's body, more powerful than anything previously, affected them. Some later documented being unable to eliminate the smell, as if it attached to their hair and skin for weeks. Physicians who valued themselves on composure acknowledged that they'd been disturbed. The Queen had become uncontrollable even after death. Victoria's body, once displayed as the representation of an empire, had deteriorated into a demonstration of human weakness. Her rejection of basic hygiene habits had rendered her body susceptible to a quick decline that no rank could stop. The silence of her court couldn't conceal it. The blossoms arranged around her casket only highlighted the difference between desired fragrance and unavoidable decay. Her funeral proceeded rapidly. Her casket sealed before the public could detect the reality. Addresses were delivered, hymns were performed, and the empire grieved. Yet for those who'd been in the room during those initial hours, the recollection wasn't of magnificence, but of a smell that appeared to dissolve the separation between life and death. The teaching of her death wasn't voiced openly. It was interred with her, remaining to persist in the records of physicians and the murmurs of workers. But it remained as a severe reminder that authority cannot remove the results of carelessness. The Queen's body, like her clothing and her rooms, displayed the evidence of her refusal to adapt. Victoria's final days demonstrated the ultimate price of her lifelong practices. With her body deteriorating faster than anyone anticipated, compelling even her physicians into withdrawal, her funeral became a competition against stench, a frantic effort to maintain respectability where respectability had already collapsed. What remained afterward was not just the recollection of her rule, but the discomfort of those who'd stood beside her casket. In the final days surrounding Queen Victoria's death, the schedules of her household workers assumed a grimmer burden. Readying the body for burial, clothing it in ceremonial fabric and positioning it for the vigil were responsibilities expected of devoted workers. Yet these responsibilities became a form of suffering themselves, because the smell of swift decay was impossible to avoid. The women tasked to manage her corpse laboured in quietness, faces drained of colour, cloths held to their mouths. Some collapsed, others needed to be escorted from the space, incapable of continuing. For them, devotion meant tolerating an environment that invaded every inhalation. Accounts left behind reveal how insufferable the assignment became. Workers documented impersonal records about the feeling of the stench penetrating their hair and garments. Even after exiting the room, they claimed that the smell persisted for days, as if it had branded them. Some admitted to washing themselves repeatedly, yet nothing eliminated the recollection of that stench. The encounter wasn't just bodily, it was mental. They felt polluted by connection, casualties of their closeness to the Queen's body. It's almost darkly humorous that while the Empire celebrated Her Majesty, her nearest attendants were reduced to battling nausea alongside her casket. Relatives weren't spared, though they possessed more liberty to create distance. Her offspring arrived to show reverence, bowed their heads and promptly withdrew. None elected to remain in the room for extended periods, even during the formal vigils. They delegated those assignments to attendants who were required to stay beside the body for hours. It's revealing that even those connected by lineage maintained their visits brief, reluctant to rest under the identical roof as the corpse. The smell based on their documentation was crushing. They couldn't balance their sorrow with the atmosphere that enveloped them. The workers carried the burden most intensely. The customs of mourning required that the Queen's body be maintained presentable. Yet nothing they accomplished could conceal what nature had already initiated. Scented oils were spread on the burial fabrics, blossoms were positioned in extensive displays, and incense was ignited. None of these measures masked the stench. If anything, the combination produced a thicker, more bewildering scent that compressed lungs and throats. Women responsible for modifying the Queen's clothing often emerged lightheaded. Some later confessed to refusing food because nausea had overtaken them during those days. The encounter penetrated the consciousness of those who remained in the palace. They later remembered an unseen presence that pursued them even after they departed the structure. One worker documented that the smell clung to her hair so intensely she could detect it while resting in bed at home. It plagued her dreams, blending with the sound of church bells and funeral songs. For weeks, she sensed as though the Queen's final presence still enveloped her, not as a recollection of magnificence, but as a sensory weight she couldn't release. If we create a parallel to contemporary times, it would be as though workers at a state funeral had to tolerate toxic vapours that mark their clothes and refuse to vanish a detail no public transmission would ever disclose. These weights demonstrate how the Queen's practices affected those surrounding her, even following death. The absence of hygiene that influenced her life produced results for her workers, compelling them to endure physical and emotional anguish. In her concluding chapter, they had no option. Service meant obedience, even to the realities of breakdown. For the monarchy, these aspects were concealed behind ritual. But for those present, it was indelible. The Queen's offspring and descendants avoided the trial of staying beside the body for extended durations. Their separation was a benefit of position. They could depart, abandon the structure, and return just for demonstrations. The workers had no such benefit. Their obligation bound them to the smell, to the clothing, and to the casket itself. Their notebooks relate a tale not of dignified grieving, but of weariness and revulsion. I cannot help but observe how the people who attended her most devotedly were also the ones who endured most profoundly from the rot she left behind. The irony is severe. The queen, who treasured devotion and obligation above everything, left her household confined in assignments that damaged their recollections. They became, essentially, her concluding casualties. The days after her burial didn't produce swift comfort. Some workers departed soon afterward, unwilling to stay in a location that held such recollections. Others remained, but mentioned the persisting stench in the palace corridors. For them, the occurrence validated something they'd long suspected, but never articulated openly, that the practices of the queen had complicated life, not just for herself, but for everyone beside her. The speed of breakdown and the power of the stench compelled everyone to face realities that had long been concealed behind sealed doors. Her rejection of washing, her preference for sealed spaces, and her disregard for hygiene all reached their peak in this instant. The workers who survived those days carried the proof in their recollections, while her offspring selected silence and separation. The funeral itself proceeded with ceremony and dignity. To the public, it was a respectful goodbye to a ruler who had governed for decades. But behind the sealed doors of the palace, the truth was vastly different. Workers murmured of nausea, of hair that smelled even following washing, of clothing that needed to be destroyed. These aren't aspects discovered in formal histories, but they reveal the concealed price of service to a queen who had existed with disregard for cleanliness. Her attendants became reluctant observers to the ultimate result of a lifetime of practices. They survived days in an environment dense with rot, executing responsibilities that left them disturbed and affected. Their devotion was challenged in a manner the public never witnessed. The workers who remained beside Victoria's body held her concluding stench with them, a reminder of the weight of devotion in the presence of insufferable circumstances. Her offspring maintained their separation, but her workers had no such refuge, rendering them the final to endure from her lifetime of carelessness. And while the funeral concluded her rule, the palace itself still contained remnants that no ritual could wholly eliminate. Following Queen Victoria's death, the assignment of updating Buckingham Palace progressed. New toilets with flushing mechanisms were added, new ventilation approaches were attempted, and windows were opened more regularly. Yet none of these actions could completely remove the accumulated stench that had developed during her lifetime. The dense drapes, the substantial carpets, and the upholstery of her personal spaces had soaked up years of perspiration, fragrance, and refuse. The smell persisted obstinately, as if the palace itself had transformed into a container of her practices. Workers assigned to cleaning following her rule characterized the encounter in language that sounded less like maintenance and more like unearthing. When drapes were removed, they held a subtle acidic thickness that no degree of beating or sunlight could eliminate. Carpets removed for substitution discharged a confined staleness that saturated the complete hallways. The furniture, even when buffed, maintained a subtle hint of human musk blended with moisture. It's oddly amusing that a palace representing imperial magnificence could also smell like a second-hand establishment that had never experienced fresh air. Guests in subsequent decades mentioned similar observations. While formal tours and royal rituals emphasized the splendor of design, those who labored in near proximity understood another truth. Workers murmured about specific spaces where the atmosphere always seemed thicker, even after years had elapsed. They claimed the fabrics possessed recollections that the threads themselves grasped onto the existence that had occupied them. To them, Victoria's presence wasn't in paintings or sculptures, but in the smell embedded in the palace structure. Historians have observed that some of her personal possessions, kept as relics, held those identical characteristics. Dresses kept in containers were characterized as rigid with ancient oils. Gloves carried remnants of the fragrance that once concealed but never substituted her natural stench. Even items meant for exhibition, such as jewellery containers lined with velvet, appeared to maintain an undertone of moisture. Museum workers at collections later acknowledged quietly that specific items arrived with what they termed the environment of the past, a courteous expression for rot. Attempts to ventilate the palace produced minimal achievement. The structure itself had been sealed for too extended, and the fabrics were too profoundly saturated. Workers cleaned, buffed, and substituted. But the feeling of thickness never entirely vanished. New rulers introduced new furnishings, yet even those additions became affected when positioned in the identical space. It was as if the very atmosphere of the palace had been trained to hold her inheritance. If we consider this in current-day language, it would be like relocating into a recently renovated residence, only to discover that the smell of mildew from decades earlier still persists in the structure. No matter how much coating is applied, the continuation of these stenches reveals how physical spaces soak up and mirror human existence. Victoria's rejection of cleanliness not only impacted her body but also her attendants. It influenced the state of the palace itself. Her presence became inseparable from the items surrounding her. Even following her death, those items communicated about her through smell, a dialect impossible to exhibit in paintings or documented records. I find it disturbing to picture museum guests staring at her possessions, while museum workers privately observe the persisting hints of perspiration and moisture. These are aspects rarely discussed, yet they transport history uncomfortably near. They remind us that leaders were not just figures of ritual, but also bodies that left impressions on their environments. The continuation of these remnants also clarifies why reports from her era highlight secrecy. Officials were cautious about what was documented and what was articulated publicly. They understood that to recognize the stench would reduce the perception of imperial majesty. Instead, the palace maintained its magnificence intact in the perception of the world, while those inside existed with the paradox of beauty positioned over rot. In this manner, Buckingham Palace transformed into more than a representation of the empire. It transformed into a holder of unspoken realities. Underneath the buffed surfaces and state rituals, there existed fabrics that recalled too much. To traverse its corridors was to inhale not just history, but residue, the invisible documentation of a queen's private existence made lasting. The palace's evolution couldn't remove the remnants of Victoria's practices. With drapes, carpets, and items still carrying the burden of her carelessness, her presence stayed not in marble sculptures, but in the continuing stench that refused to depart. What followed was the acknowledgement that even her throne held a legacy nobody desired to identify. Queen Victoria's rule extended across nearly a century, an era when Britain developed into a global empire that contacted every continent of the world. She represented a figure of order, domestic values, and national dignity. Sculptures were erected in her tribute, streets were titled after her, and her face showed on coins that moved through the hands of millions. Yet within her private realm, the practices she maintained left a vastly different inheritance. Her body and her environment were affected by carelessness, and that carelessness influenced the manner she was recalled by those who existed nearest to her. It wasn't the magnificence of demonstrations or addresses that persisted in their recollection, but the stench that attached to her rooms and her possessions. In her personal spaces, fabrics maintained accumulated perspiration, fragrance, and stagnant air. These weren't simple aspects that disappeared with time, even following her death. The drapes and carpets were claimed to hold the thickness of years without fresh air or adequate cleaning. Furniture soaked up her presence in manners that no buffing could reverse. Workers who managed her garments characterized them as rigid with oils and moisture, and these clothes were kept instead of washed. When guests later accessed those spaces, some claimed that the atmosphere itself appeared different, thicker, as if it held the recollection of the Queen. it almost seems ridiculous that the representation of the British Empire existed surrounded by smells that would humiliate even the smallest lodging. This paradox between perception and truth became more apparent following her death. The speed of breakdown, the difficulties of her attendance, and the stenches that saturated her concluding room made it evident that her private practices had enduring results. Physicians who laboured with her body observed that bacteria had multiplied in her tissues, accelerating rot. Workers who maintained vigil documented in their notebooks about nausea and weariness. Her offspring, though devoted, rejected extended hours beside her casket. Publicly, the Empire displayed the funeral as respectful and dignified. Privately, those participating recalled the crushing atmosphere and the competition to inter her before controversy could distribute. Even Buckingham Palace, a representation of state authority, displayed the impressions of her existence. Improvements such as flushed toilets and enhanced ventilation couldn't remove what had already been soaked up. Drapes, carpets and upholstery held remnants that continued long following her departure. Items kept for exhibition, such as dresses and gloves, were claimed to possess a subtle but undeniable thickness, a reminder of the body that once utilised them. Collection workers quietly confessed that some items still appeared to maintain the environment of the past. If we contrast this to today, it would be like accessing a presidential home, updated with contemporary mechanisms, but still smelling subtly of refuse left decades previously. What makes this tale remarkable is not just the physical proof, but the quietness that enveloped it. Publicly, her rule was honoured as one of advancement and moral structure. The empire valued itself on order and cleanliness. Yet the Queen herself resisted fundamental hygiene. Her rejection of regular washing, her reliance on fabrics that captured perspiration, and her application of fragrances to conceal stenches were recognised to her workers, but rarely mentioned beyond palace boundaries. Those who attended her held the weight of this quietness, surviving circumstances that contradicted with the empire's principles. I think the aspect that troubles me most is how her attendants became reluctant observers to this concealed reality, bound by devotion to survive what nobody dared to confess openly. Their recollections inform us more than formal histories ever could. They expose the price of quietness, the burden of service, and the distance between public perception and private truth. Her inheritance, then, was dual. To the world, she was the mother of the empire, directing Britain through industrial growth and global reach. To those within the palace, she was a figure enveloped by stench and carelessness. Both realities coexisted simultaneously, and together they construct a fuller image of her rule. It wasn't just her policies and her perception that influenced history, but also the remnants she left behind in fabrics, furniture, and the very atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. The continuation of these aspects challenges the manner we consider history. We often picture rulers as remote, kept in marble or bronze, unaffected by the ordinary truths of the body. Yet Victoria's tale reminds us that even the most powerful figure cannot avoid those truths. Her practices influenced not just her health, but also the encounter of everyone surrounding her. They became part of the palace itself, a concealed inheritance that persisted long following her crown was transferred to another. In the conclusion, Queen Victoria's rule left memorials, legislation and cultural customs that influenced the contemporary world. But it also left something less apparent and far less honoured: the recollection of a smell that refused to disappear. To workers, attendants, and even collection workers, this stench became an unspoken reality about her existence. The throne radiated brilliantly in the perception of the world, but in private it held the shadow of her carelessness. That shadow pursued her even into death, when her body exposed her inheritance with a speed and power that no ritual could hide. The tale of her hygiene may appear minor compared to the extent of empire, but it discloses something fundamental. It reveals how authority can conceal weaknesses how appearances can surpass truth, and how quietness can maintain in perception at the expense of reality. It also reveals how history is not just documented in papers and addresses, but also in the impressions left on items, spaces, and recollections. Victoria's rule wasn't just political, it was bodily, and that physicality left remnants that time couldn't remove. Her identity persists in history texts, her sculptures remain across the world, and her rule is recalled as one of the longest and most significant in British history. Yet for those who remained near to her, what persists most intensely is something wholly different. It is the recollection of a stench that attached to fabrics, penetrated into furniture, and plagued the palace. That stench became her unspoken inheritance, the portion of her tale nobody desired to document, but nobody could dismiss. Victoria governed for almost a century, but her body never avoided the shadow of carelessness. Her throne held both the illumination of empire and the burden of her private practices. For many who knew her, the genuine inheritance she left behind was not just memorials and legislation, but the persisting scent of a queen who never accepted the simplest acts of care. This was the smell of her throne, a reminder that magnificence and rot often exist side by side. This completes the tale of Queen Victoria's concealed hygiene, a side of history rarely articulated but profoundly disclosing. Thank you for remaining with me through this exploration. May your night be calm, your rest peaceful, and may you drift into sleep, far removed from the dense atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. Good night.